Hey guys, tonight, the fog, the clock, and a faded map. The fog was not merely weather, it was the breath of London itself, thick, sulphurous, and clinging. It swallowed the gaslight, turning each yellow orb into a solitary, drowned sun. In this choking obscurity, where the familiar geometry of the city dissolved into a damp brown chaos, lived Elias Thorne. Elias was a man perpetually caught between the old and the new, a fledgling journalist whose ambition had consistently outpaced his luck. His office, a cramped fourth-floor garret in the heart of Bloomsbury, offered a vantage point over the city, though today it offered only a blinding wall of mist. The relentless tick-tock of a cheap mantel clock, its pendulum a frantic metronome against the city's slow, wet decay, seemed to be the only thing marking the passage of time. At 28, Elias was already weary of the respectable failures of his career. He wrote puff pieces about the latest scientific marvels or dreary accounts of minor court proceedings, his prose polished, but his subject matter utterly forgettable. He craved the real London, the London of secrets, of midnight transactions, of lives lived fiercely beneath the veneer of Queen Victoria's morality. "Another piece on improved sewer systems, Thorne?" muttered a voice from the doorway. It was Mr. Finch, the landlord, a man whose face was a road map of unpaid rents. He carried a small lamp, its glow weak against the enveloping gloom. Elias sighed, stacking his paper neat. "No, Finch, it's an editorial on the hypocrisy of the temperance movement. Very biting, I assure you." Finch merely grunted. "Biting editorials don't pay for coal. There's a box arrived for you, delivered by some silent, stooped fellow who looked like he'd been dragged out of the Thames mud. He said it was a matter of legacy." Elias frowned. He had no legacy. His parents, long deceased, had left him nothing but a few leather-bound books and a heavy, persistent sense of duty. He took the small wooden box from Finch, noting the strange, faintly metallic scent clinging to the wood. It was old, certainly pre-Victorian, dark with age and secured with a small brass clasp that was strangely cool to the touch. Once Finch was gone, Elias turned the box over in his hands. There was no address, no sender's name, only a single crudely carved T on the lid. With a prickle of genuine curiosity, Elias inserted his letter opener into the clasp and pried it open. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded crimson velvet, were two objects, a small tarnished silver ring inscribed with an unrecognizable sigil, and a faded map. The map was not drawn on paper, but on a thin, stiff piece of yellowed canvas, brittle at the edges. It was small enough to be held in one palm, yet its lines were dense, drawn in fading sepia ink. It depicted an area of London Elias recognized instantly, the densely populated, chaotic maze surrounding the Seven Dials district and stretching toward the river docks. But it was a London he did not know. Instead of the standard streets, the map showed only major thoroughfares marked in thin, standard lines, while the narrow alleys, courts, and mews were overlaid with a dizzying web of thick, bold routes. These bold lines did not connect to known buildings. Instead, they terminated abruptly at points marked with strange, cryptic symbols: a tilted lantern, a closed fist, a serpent coiled around a tankard. The symbols were too precise to be random. They looked like the markers of hidden, specific locations. Elias, momentarily forgetting his deadline, laid the map flat under the glare of his desk lamp. He recognized one of the major thoroughfares marked Drury Lane. Following a thick, bold line from there, his finger landed on a spot marked with the symbol of a tilted gaslight, located where a known, dilapidated tailor shop stood. He knew that shop well. He passed it daily. It was perpetually shut, its windows dusty and covered. Could that shop conceal an entrance to something else? A sudden, sharp memory surfaced. His grandfather, a taciturn, reserved man who had worked as a solicitor's clerk, had occasionally disappeared late into the night, returning near dawn with the scent of coal smoke, cheap tobacco,
and a faint, sweet smell he couldn't place. Elias once asked him where he went. His grandfather had only smiled, a secretive, distant expression. "I visit the places where the real city is kept, my boy, away from the eyes of the queen." Could this map be his grandfather's, a legacy of secret knowledge rather than mere gold? Elias looked again at the symbols, his heart starting to beat a quick, excited rhythm. He picked up the silver ring, turning it over. It was heavier than it looked, its metal cool against his skin. The sigil, a winged lion holding a foaming stein, was intricate and alien. He slipped it onto his index finger. It fit perfectly. This was no ordinary map. It was a key, a coded invitation, perhaps a warning. It pointed not to landmarks of stone and commerce, but to the hidden arteries of Victorian vice, pleasure, and intrigue, the hidden pubs. The concept was daring. These were not the gin palaces of the masses, gaudy and loud, nor the respectable taverns for the professional class. These were the illegal, unregistered places, the blind pigs, the shebeens and kiddies, where men and women met in secrecy, away from the prying eyes of the constables and the moral censors. Places where the law had no jurisdiction, and where the most dangerous secrets of London were traded for a pint of dubious ale or a glass of mother's ruin. His journalist instinct flared to life, extinguishing the dread of Finch's imminent return. This was the story he had been waiting for, a true, buried narrative of the city's soul. He pulled on his thick wool coat, secured his scarf, and checked his pocket for his meager supply of coins. The clock on the mantelpiece, having been so fastidious about time, now seemed irrelevant. The real clock was ticking in the fog, measured by the fading light and the rising tide of evening traffic. He tucked the canvas map into his inner coat pocket, the silver ring a strange, comforting weight on his finger. His destination, Drury Lane, the dilapidated tailor shop, the symbol of the tilted gaslight. As Elias stepped out of the safety of his garret and onto the winding, treacherous stairs, the sound of the city hit him, the clatter of a passing cab, the shouts of a newsboy, the distant, mournful call of a ship's horn on the Thames. But beneath it all, he felt a new, insistent thrum, the quiet invitation of the hidden London, finally accessible. He knew the danger was immense. The people who operated these hidden establishments and the patrons who used them would be fiercely protective of their anonymity. Curiosity in this London could get a man killed, but Elias was tired of being a spectator in his own life. He descended to the street, stepping directly into the oppressive embrace of the fog. The air tasted of soot and river decay. Ahead, the gaslight on the corner struggled, flickering like a dying heart. Elias paused, took a deep breath of the tainted air, and set his face towards the shadows. He was following a faded map into a London he had only dreamed of, seeking stories only whispered about, all connected by the common dark thread of cheap gin, smoke, and dangerous secrecy. The journey had begun. He was no longer Elias Thorne, failed essayist. He was a seeker of the truth hidden behind the city's crumbling facade. The fickle grip of mother's ruin. Elias Thorne stepped down from his Bloomsbury garret into the street, the canvas map burning a phantom heat through the wool of his coat. The fog, denser now than before, muted the sounds of the afternoon, turning the city into a vast, whispering crypt. He walked quickly, his purpose sharpened by the secret weight of the silver ring and the cryptic lines of the map. But as he plunged deeper into the heart of London, away from the relative respectability of his district and towards the grime of Drury Lane, he could not escape the era's ubiquitous, intoxicating curse: gin. The street was his classroom, and the subject was mother's ruin. It was everywhere. It clung to the air, a faint medicinal sweetness overlaying the stench of coal smoke and refuse. It was in the staggering gait of the laborer on his way to his shift, and the nervous tremor in the hand of the woman huddled in a doorway. Gin was the swift, cheap solvent for the misery of the industrial age. For a few farthings, one could purchase oblivion, a brief, fiery vacation from the relentless reality of 12-hour factory days, damp housing, and constant hunger.
Elias, a man who preferred the clear discipline of black coffee, saw the gin palaces as monstrous architectural contradictions. They were garishly decorated, vast halls of plate glass and polished brass, ostentatiously bright and welcoming, a direct, sneering contrast to the poverty that surrounded them. They stood like gilded traps, beckoning the downtrodden with their promise of quick forgetfulness. He passed a notorious establishment, the King's Tipple. The very name was a lie. No king would stoop to this fiery poison. Through the steamed-up windows, Elias saw figures slumped over the counter, their faces slack and pale in the harsh lamplight. It was a tableau of despair, one he had witnessed 1,000 times, yet today it struck him differently. This, he thought, clutching the map tighter, is the official, licensed face of despair. What must happen in the places built to hide from the official world? The moralizers, the bishops, the temperance societies, the stern ladies of the aristocracy, spoke of gin as a failure of character, a weakness of the lower classes. They condemned the victim, never the system that made the poison so necessary. They failed to understand that gin was the poor man's refuge. It dulled the cold, quieted the screaming child, and provided a shared, albeit toxic, communion among the wretched. It was fickle because its solace was fleeting. The hangover brought back the pain with a vicious, magnified clarity, trapping the drinker in a devastating loop. His gaze fell upon a young boy, perhaps 7 years old, carrying a tin pitcher and walking with a careful sobriety that belied his age. The boy was heading into a side alley, undoubtedly on an errand to fetch his parents' nightly measure. Elias felt a familiar journalistic indignation rise up. This was the tragedy that fueled his desire for change, his need to expose the rot beneath the silk and lace of Victorian respectability. It was this widespread social poison that provided the need for the hidden pubs. If the licensed gin palaces were garish theaters of obvious misery, the establishments marked on his map, the Blind Pigs, the Shebeens, must be sanctuaries of discreet misery, or perhaps even sanctuaries of dangerous freedom. Elias theorized that in the legal pubs one sought oblivion. In the secret pubs, one sought a shield against the eyes of the police, the moral judgment of the wealthy, and the ears of informants. What secrets were safe only under the combined cover of barkness, cheap smoke, and illicit spirit? He pictured the pub marked with the tilted gaslight. It wasn't advertised. It had no polished brass or welcoming window. Its patrons would be there not to forget their lives, but to conduct the parts of their lives that could not bear the scrutiny of the day. Smugglers, radicals, disgraced gentry, thieves, and perhaps the very people who governed the unseen threads of London's power structure. As his walk took him through a particularly dismal thoroughfare near the docks, the smell intensified. The odor of cheap spirit, heavy and cloying, seemed to be seeping from the very bricks. He saw a man leaning against a wall, coughing deep, ragged spasms that shook his thin frame. The man's eyes, red-rimmed and vacant, glanced at Elias with an impersonal hostility before settling on the dark stain of gin near his boots. Elias felt a moment of cold self-doubt. He was venturing into a world governed by desperation, where the very air was a cocktail of vice and survival. His sole protection was a faded scrap of canvas and a mysterious ring. He was an observer, an outsider, a man of paper and ink, entering a domain ruled by brute necessity and sharp blades. He paused near a muddy crossing, the fog swirling around his knees. He pulled the silver ring off his finger and examined the winged lion's sigil. It felt less like a key and more like a brand. What was his grandfather's connection to this world? Had he been a spy, a fence, a mere connoisseur of forbidden spaces? The mystery fueled his advance, overcoming the rising tide of fear. He remembered a conversation he had with a grizzled old reporter at his newspaper, a man who had seen everything. "You want to find the truth, Thorne? Don't look in Parliament or the churches. Look where men go when they can't afford to be seen. Look in the gin hells. That is where the power brokers meet the pawns. The real secrets, the ones that could topple a ministry, they're whispered after the second glass of white Satan, not in a velvet smoking room." The reporter's words now echoed in the fog. Elias understood that the gin, the mother's ruin, was the great equalizer. It stripped away the rigid class divisions of London. In these hidden pubs, the factory owner and the pickpocket could momentarily share a space, united by their need for concealment and their shared consumption of the fiery spirit. It was fickle because its solace was fleeting. The hangover brought back the pain with a vicious, magnified clarity, trapping the drinker in a devastating loop. His gaze fell upon a young boy, perhaps 7 years old, carrying a tin pitcher and walking with a careful sobriety that belied his age. The boy was heading into a side alley, undoubtedly on an errand to fetch his parents' nightly measure. Elias felt a familiar journalistic indignation rise up. This was the tragedy that fueled his desire for change, his need to expose the rot beneath the silk and lace of Victorian respectability. It was this widespread social poison that provided the need for the hidden pubs. If the licensed gin palaces were garish theaters of obvious misery, the establishments marked on his map, the Blind Pigs, the Shebeens, must be sanctuaries of discreet misery, or perhaps even sanctuaries of dangerous freedom. Elias theorized that in the legal pubs one sought oblivion, in the secret pubs one sought a shield against the eyes of the police, the moral judgment of the wealthy, and the ears of informants. What secrets were safe only under the combined cover of darkness, cheap smoke, and illicit spirit? He pictured the pub marked with the tilted gaslight. It wasn't advertised. It had no polished brass or welcoming window. Its patrons would be there not to forget their lives, but to conduct the parts of their lives that could not bear the scrutiny of the day. Smugglers, radicals, disgraced gentry, thieves, and perhaps the very people who govern the unseen threads of London's power structure. As his walk took him through a particularly dismal thoroughfare near the docks, the smell intensified. The odor of cheap spirit, heavy and cloying, seemed to be seeping from the very bricks. He saw a man leaning against a wall, coughing deep, ragged spasms that shook his thin frame. The man's eyes, red-rimmed and vacant, glanced at Elias with an impersonal hostility before settling on the dark stain of gin near his boots. Elias felt a moment of cold self-doubt. He was venturing into a world governed by desperation, where the very air was a cocktail of vice and survival. His sole protection was a faded scrap of canvas and a mysterious ring. He was an observer, an outsider, a man of paper and ink, entering a domain ruled by brute necessity and sharp blades. He paused near a muddy crossing, the fog swirling around his knees. He pulled the silver ring off his finger and examined the winged lion's sigil. It felt less like a key and more like a brand. What was his grandfather's connection to this world? Had he been a spy, a fence, a mere connoisseur of forbidden spaces? The mystery fueled his advance, overcoming the rising tide of fear. He remembered a conversation he had with a grizzled old reporter at his newspaper, a man who had seen everything.
You want to find the truth, Thorn? Don't look in Parliament or the churches. Look where men go when they can't afford to be seen. Look in the gin hells. That is where the power brokers meet the pawns. The real secrets, the ones that could topple a ministry, they're whispered after the second glass of white Satan, not in a velvet smoking room. The reporter's words now echoed in the fog. Elias understood that the gin, the mother's ruin, was the great equalizer. It stripped away the rigid class divisions of London. In these hidden pubs, the factory owner and the pickpocket could momentarily share a space, united by their need for concealment and their shared consumption of the fiery spirit. It was fickle because its solace was fleeting. The hangover brought back the pain with a vicious, magnified clarity, trapping the drinker in a devastating loop. His gaze fell upon a young boy, perhaps 7 years old, carrying a tin pitcher and walking with a careful sobriety.
The whisper of the blind pig. Elias Thorne stood before the darkness, the faint, sickening sweet odor of cheap gin and close-packed bodies, a tangible force pressing against him. The pivot door of the gentleman's cut, the derelict tailor shop, had opened just wide enough to reveal a jagged, vertical slice of blackness. This was the moment of no return. Stepping across the threshold was an abandonment of the legal, gaslit world and an embrace of the secrets promised by his grandfather's cryptic map. He slid the silver ring back onto his index finger. The winged lion's sigil felt like a countersign, a badge of unauthorized entry. Taking a breath of the sulphurous London air, he slipped through the opening. The darkness immediately engulfed him. The door swung shut behind him with a low, heavy thump that swallowed all sound from the street outside. He was trapped, utterly sightless for a terrifying instant. Then a sudden, muffled sound filtered through the oppressive black. Not a loud roar of drunken revelry, but a pervasive low whisper, a collective drone of hushed voices, shuffling boots, and the clinking of cheap glass. This was not the boisterousness of a public house. It was the guarded hum of a place defined by its need for secrecy. A light source materialized ahead, not a gas light, but a few flickering oil lamps tucked strategically into recesses in the brickwork, casting long, nervous shadows. He found himself in a narrow, short passage that smelled overwhelmingly of damp earth and stale smoke. The air was thick, heavy enough to chew on, and instantly warmer than the street outside. Before him, a heavy velvet curtain, dark green and seemingly cut from old drapery, marked the transition into the main room. Elias straightened his coat, adopted the most neutral, unthreatening expression he could muster, and pushed the curtain aside. The shift in atmosphere was immediate and absolute, like walking from a silent, frozen moor into a cramped, roaring cave. This was the Blind Pig. It was not a pub so much as a cellar that had been hastily yet functionally converted. The ceiling was heavy, oak beams crisscrossing above him, stained black with decades of coal smoke. The room was perhaps 30 feet long, lined on one side with rough-hewn wooden benches, and dominated at the far end by a primitive counter constructed of old barrels and a plank of wood. The light was a smoky, deceptive amber, provided mainly by 3 large, greasy wick oil lamps. These lamps created pools of hazy illumination that did nothing to pierce the deep shadows clinging to the corners, shadows that seemed to house their own silent inhabitants. The clientele was a startling mosaic of Victorian life. Elias spotted a factory foreman, his face etched with soot and fatigue, sitting elbow to elbow with a woman in a vivid, albeit torn, scarlet dress, likely a Judy, a woman of the streets. Beside them, 2 men in surprisingly clean, dark frock coats, clearly professionals, spoke in rapid, clipped tones, their faces shielded by the brims of their hats. and in a corner, nursing a pewter mug, sat a man whose face was familiar to Elias, Silas Croft, a minor member of Parliament known for his fiery temperance speeches. Croft, the public moralist, drinking illicitly in a den of iniquity. Elias felt the heat of the air and the weight of 100 concealed eyes. Every head in the room had turned toward him the moment he stepped through the curtain. He was the newcomer, the unknown variable. He walked with deliberate steadiness to the makeshift bar, making sure his movements betrayed no nervousness. The floor beneath his feet was covered in a thick layer of sawdust, damp and sticky with spilled liquid. Behind the counter stood the barkeep, a massive, barrel-chested woman whose face looked like it had been carved from the same scarred oak as the beams above. She was not welcoming, she was assessing. Her eyes, dark and sharp, went straight to his hands, lingering on the silver ring. Elias placed a sovereign on the counter. It was a brazen move, too much money for a single drink, but it was an offering of good faith and capability. The woman did not touch the coin. Her voice, when it came, was a low, guttural rasp that did not rise above the room's ambient hum. "You've come far, gentlemen." The word gentleman was a loaded question, a challenge. "What's your poison?" "A pint of your best porter," Elias said, keeping his voice level, "and a measure of whatever you call your gin for the cold." She finally picked up the coin, examining it closely, then nodded, a brief, silent acceptance. The porter she poured from a cracked ceramic jug was thick and dark. The gin, dispensed from a squat, unlabeled bottle, was clear and oily. It looked, smelled, and probably tasted like distilled fire and betrayal, pure mother's ruin. As he waited for his change, Elias finally understood the power of the atmosphere. It wasn't just physical, it was psychological. The whisper was the sound of necessary caution. The low light was the color of complicity. Here, every shared breath was a shared secret. He took a slow, deliberate sip of the gin. It hit the back of his throat like a hammer blow, instantly numbing his tongue and bringing tears to his eyes. But the heat spread quickly, a false, fiery sense of courage. His task was not just to drink, but to blend. He moved away from the bar, settling on a secluded bench against the back wall, near the shadowed corner where the Member of Parliament, Croft, sat. He pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook and a pencil, a professional habit he knew he should perhaps abandon, but which offered a shield of purpose. He began to draw, not to write, attempting to sketch the serpentine coil symbol from his map, hoping the action made him look like a preoccupied, harmless eccentric. He could feel the gazes on him begin to recede, as if deciding he was less dangerous than they first thought. They had assessed the clothes, the money, and the ring, and the determined solitude, and filed him away as either an investigative reporter, in which case ignore him, or a lost upper-class thrill-seeker, in which case fleece him later. From his vantage point, Elias began to observe. He realized the blind pig was a nexus for information exchange. The two men in frock coats were discussing shipping manifestos, using coded language. "The red herring is heavier than expected," one murmured. "She'll need 3 more pigs before she can clear the docks." Pigs, Elias realized, was slang for something illicit, perhaps hidden cargo, or maybe even people. Then he heard a woman's voice, sharp and urgent, coming from the corner near Croft. "He's looking for the tilted gaslight, Silas. He knows the marks." Elias froze, the pewter mug halfway to his lips. They were talking about him, or rather about the knowledge he possessed. He risked a glance toward the corner. Croft, the MP, was not just drinking, but arguing intensely with a pale, fierce-looking woman in a dark cloak, the very woman who had spoken. Croft, eyes wide and panicked, shook his head violently. "I told you, there are a dozen tilted gaslights. It's an old sign. It means nothing," Croft hissed. The woman leaned closer. "But the ring, Silas. Did you see the ring? The lion's head has reappeared after 20 years. Elias's index finger twitched. The ring. His grandfather's ring, it was not just an ornament, it was a specific recognizable symbol of a forgotten society or faction within this hidden world.
He understood now. His entry into this blind pig had not been an unnoticed private adventure. It had been an event. The ring had been his key, but it was also his brand, a mark that linked him to a past these people clearly feared or respected. The barkeep suddenly slammed a tankard down on the counter with unnecessary force, the sharp sound cutting through the whispered drone. It was a warning. Elias took the cue instantly. He focused on his drink, breathing shallowly, his ears straining. He needed to hear more about the lion's head and what it represented. But the woman and Croft had gone silent, their argument shifting into a tight, conspiratorial silence. He was no longer just a journalist seeking a story. He was wearing the legacy of an organization that might have been dead for decades or might simply have been waiting in the shadows. His grandfather had not just left him a map, he had initiated him into a war. The atmosphere of the blind pig was no longer simply smoky and secretive. It was charged with potential violence. Elias had bought himself a seat at the table of London's hidden power structure, and the price of that seat, he suspected, was far higher than the sovereign he had paid. He finished his gin in one swallow, the liquid burning away the last vestiges of the London fog, leaving only a cold, hard clarity in his mind. He was no longer looking for secrets. The secrets were looking for him. He was ready to begin his investigation. The first step would be to find out what the lion's head was and why its reappearance had terrified a member of Parliament. A shadowed exchange of information. The heat from the cheap gin had evaporated, replaced by the chill of sudden, acute danger. Elias Thorne remained perfectly still on the rough-hewn bench, his face turned towards his empty mug, the silver ring a burning weight on his finger. The silence from the corner where Silas Croft, the frantic MP, and the pale, fierce woman were seated was more damning than any loud accusation. They had stopped arguing. They were watching him. Elias knew he had to appear utterly preoccupied, the casual, harmless tourist of the underworld. He dipped his pencil and pretended to adjust his sketch, though his eyes were now hyper-focused on the subtle movements and low murmurs of the room. The atmosphere in the blind pig was a living thing, dense with suspicion and the smell of dark secrets. The low, incessant whisper of the room seemed to rise and fall in waves, like a secretive tide. He needed to find a new source of information, something that didn't involve the terrifying prospect of confronting the woman who recognized the lion's head sigil. His attention shifted to the two men in frock coats near the bar, the ones who had been discussing red herring cargo. They had finished their drinks and were now engaged in a complex, ritualistic exchange. One of the men, lean and sharp-featured, reached into his inner pocket and produced a small leather pouch. "The inventory is exact, Mr. Finch," the lean man murmured, his voice barely audible over the general drone. Elias's spine straightened. Finch. Was this the same Mr. Finch who was his landlord, the man perpetually anxious about rent, the one who delivered the box containing the map? The thought was jarring, a sudden crack in the ordered structure of his life. The second man, larger, with the shoulders of a dock worker but the polished boots of a courier, took the pouch. He did not open it. Instead, he produced a tightly rolled cylinder of parchment, secured with a thin black ribbon and a dollop of red hardened wax. This was the core of the shadowed exchange. Not money, not violence, but information and verification traded in the deepest secrecy. And the confirmation? The lean man pressed. The courier, the probable Mr. Finch, held up the parchment. The Lady May sails on the turn of the tide, not before the 21st. All entries are cross-referenced with the tally from the 7 Dials watch. Elias struggled to process the fragments. A ship, the Lady May, a date, the 21st, and a name, the 7 Dials watch. Was this a legitimate security group or the name of a hidden society? Given the location, the latter seemed overwhelmingly likely.
He risked a subtle movement, tilting his ear just slightly toward them, pretending to adjust his collar. The lean man nodded stiffly, accepting the parchment. Excellent. The recipient will require this before the bells toll on the 22nd. The integrity of the Covenant of Smoke depends on it. The Covenant of Smoke. That was another name. Elias felt a surge of journalistic excitement, quickly tempered by caution. He was gathering names for a network, the Lion's Head, the Seven Dials Watch, the Covenant of Smoke, all intersecting around a secret shipment on the Lady May. The central conflict was coalescing, a clandestine operation dependent on the hidden infrastructure of London. The two men exchanged a final wordless nod and melted into the shadows, the courier toward the back door near the barrows, and the lean man toward the pivot door that led back to the tailor shop. Elias had minutes most. He needed to confirm his landlord's identity. The courier was close enough now. Elias casually adjusted his footing, dropping his pencil near the courier's passing route. "My apologies, sir," he muttered, bending quickly to retrieve the pencil. As he straightened, he caught a quick, clear glimpse of the courier's face in the passing lamplight. It was not his landlord, Mr. Finch. This man was younger, bulkier, lacking the anxious features of the man who collected his rent. Elias felt a moment of disorientation. Mr. Finch was a professional code name, a placeholder, not a personal identity. This realization added another layer to the complexity. Everyone here was operating under a guise, their identities as shifting and unreliable as the fog outside. He sat back, his heart racing. He had witnessed a crucial handover. The exchange was clearly linked to his map, to the secret world his grandfather had left him. The information was fragmented, cryptic, but undeniable. A high-stakes plan was underway, involving multiple secret factions, culminating near the docks on the 21st. He needed to connect these dots. He glanced back at the corner where Silas Croft and the woman were. They were still observing him, their silence a tangible barrier. Croft looked haunted, his face a roadmap of regret. The woman, however, possessed an unnerving composure, her eyes fixed on the silver ring. Elias decided the only way to deflect their attention was to look for another source of information, to shift the focal point of the room. He ordered another measure of the noxious gin, placing a smaller, more appropriate coin on the counter this time. The barkeep, who had been cleaning a glass with slow, deliberate movements, leaned in close as she poured the drink. "The lion's head is not a common symbol, Thorne," she whispered, using his surname with cool familiarity. Elias nearly recoiled. How did she know his name? His newspaper articles were anonymous. His rent was collected by Mr. Finch. "I inherited it," Elias admitted, quietly, watching her face. "The inheritance is cold, but the debt is not," she rasped, her voice never rising above the low hum of the room. Debt. The word hung in the air, heavy and sharp. This was not about a past due bill. It was about an obligation, a responsibility, perhaps a blood debt incurred by his grandfather. She continued, her eyes never leaving his. "The Seven Dials Watch believes the Covenant is selling their assets. They seek proof. They need someone with a mark they trust. The Lion's Head is the only mark left that the old guard respects."
She was offering him the central conflict, the key to the whole story, but attaching a price that was terrifying: active participation. "Who is selling whose assets?" Elias asked, his voice low and strained. "The Covenant of Smoke," she whispered, leaning closer, her breath smelling of stale tobacco and something medicinal. "They control the docks, the passage. They are moving the red herring, the asset, out of the city. The watch, the people your grandfather swore by, they want that asset recovered before the Lady May sails." The central conflict was now chillingly clear, a race against time to prevent a secret asset from leaving London, orchestrated by two warring factions of the city's hidden elite.
The 7 Dials watch needed him, the inheritor of the lion's head, to recover it from the covenant of smoke. She placed a small folded piece of paper beside his glass of gin. The watch meets tomorrow night, the Silent Pint, near Wapping. You have a key, now you need a meeting place. Elias scooped up the paper. The barkeep looked past him, her attention already shifting, signaling the end of their low-key meeting. He knew he should flee. The information he held now, the date, the ship, the warring factions, his grandfather's debt, was enough to get him murdered 3 times over. But the realization that his grandfather had been a part of this, that the family legacy was one of intrigue and duty rather than simply failure, galvanized him. He looked once more at Silas Croft, the sweating, pale MP, now being aggressively shielded by the dark-cloaked woman. Croft was part of the covenant, perhaps, or a mere pawn being forced to cooperate. Elias stood up slowly, nodding curtly to the barkeep, the only farewell necessary in this place of secrets. He walked deliberately back towards the velvet curtain. He felt the eyes of Croft and the woman boring into his back, but he did not falter. He pushed through the curtain, the sounds of the blind pig immediately muffling behind him. He reached the pivot door, found the slight groove, and pulled. The heavy slab of wood groaned open. Elias stepped back into the street. The fog was denser than ever, the air colder, sharper, but the world had irrevocably changed. He was no longer a journalist looking in. He was an operative expected at a meeting called the Silent Pint, holding the identity of a long-dead operative, the Lion's Head, and carrying the burden of his debt. He looked at his hand, the silver ring glinting faintly in the pathetic light of the nearest gas lamp. A shadowed exchange of information had just made him the primary participant in the central conflict. The rules of the gutter and the gentry. Elias Torn did not return directly to his garret. The air in the Blind Pig had saturated him, not just with smoke and gin, but with knowledge, and he felt as though the very bricks of Bloomsbury would betray the secrets he now carried. Instead, he walked aimlessly for hours, letting the residual adrenaline slowly dissipate, dissecting the information he had gathered. The crumpled piece of paper in his pocket, indicating the meeting at the Silent Pint, felt like a warrant for his arrest, or worse, a death sentence. The fundamental truth revealed in the Blind Pig was the annihilation of the outward Victorian social structure. In the gaslit world, a duke and a dustman shared no space, no language, and certainly no secrets. But in the shadows of the hidden tap, they were bound by a single stringent constitution. This was the rules of the gutter and the gentry. Elias understood that the survival of these clandestine establishments depended on a radical, self-enforced code of conduct. He began to catalog these unwritten laws in his mind, realizing they were the only things protecting him now. The first rule was the most obvious: never ask a name and never give a true one. In The Blind Pig, Elias had heard the name Mr. Finch, but it was a profession, a role, not an identity. His own name, Torn, had only been uttered by the barkeep, a sign that she was either an old associate of his grandfather or someone with access to records far more dangerous than parish logs. The secrecy of the venue was worthless if the identities of its patrons were known outside. Here, the lord of the manor was simply the shadow, and the petty thief was the runner. Social rank, debts, wives, and even crimes committed elsewhere were nullified upon entry. This realization struck Elias with the force of a revelation. The hidden pubs were not merely places to drink, they were temporary states of exception. For a few hours, the laws of the Queen, the Church, and society were suspended. The only law that mattered was the one agreed upon by the collective, enforced by silent consensus and the ever-present threat of violence. The most democratic element of the code was the equality of transgression. In The Blind Pig, Elias had heard the name Mr. Finch, but it was a profession, a role, not an identity. His own name, Torn, had only been uttered by the barkeep, a sign that she was either an old associate of his grandfather or someone with access to records far more dangerous than parish logs. The secrecy of the venue was worthless if the identities of its patrons were known outside. Here, the lord of the manor was simply the shadow, and the petty thief was the runner. Social rank, debts, wives, and even crimes committed elsewhere were nullified upon entry. This realization struck Elias with the force of a revelation. The hidden pubs were not merely places to drink, they were temporary states of exception. For a few hours, the laws of the Queen, the Church, and society were suspended. The only law that mattered was the one agreed upon by the collective, enforced by silent consensus and the ever-present threat of violence. The most democratic element of the code was the equality of transgression. In The Blind Pig, Elias had heard the name Mr. Finch, but it was a profession, a role, not an identity. His own name, Torn, had only been uttered by the barkeep, a sign that she was either an old associate of his grandfather or someone with access to records far more dangerous than parish logs. The secrecy of the venue was worthless if the identities of its patrons were known outside. Here, the lord of the manor was simply the shadow, and the petty thief was the runner. Social rank, debts, wives, and even crimes committed elsewhere were nullified upon entry. This realization struck Elias with the force of a revelation. The hidden pubs were not merely places to drink, they were temporary states of exception. For a few hours, the laws of the Queen, the Church, and society were suspended. The only law that mattered was the one agreed upon by the collective, enforced by silent consensus and the ever-present threat of violence. The most democratic element of the code was the equality of transgression. In The Blind Pig, Elias had heard the name Mr. Finch, but it was a profession, a role, not an identity. His own name, Torn, had only been uttered by the barkeep, a sign that she was either an old associate of his grandfather or someone with access to records far more dangerous than parish logs. The secrecy of the venue was worthless if the identities of its patrons were known outside. Here, the lord of the manor was simply the shadow, and the petty thief was the runner. Social rank, debts, wives, and even crimes committed elsewhere were nullified upon entry. This realization struck Elias with the force of a revelation. The hidden pubs were not merely places to drink, they were temporary states of exception. For a few hours, the laws of the Queen, the Church, and society were suspended. The only law that mattered was the one agreed upon by the collective, enforced by silent consensus and the ever-present threat of violence. The most democratic element of the code was the equality of transgression. In The Blind Pig, Elias had heard the name Mr. Finch, but it was a profession, a role, not an identity. His own name, Torn, had only been uttered by the barkeep, a sign that she was either an old associate of his grandfather or someone with access to records far more dangerous than parish logs. The secrecy of the venue was worthless if the identities of its patrons were known outside. Here, the lord of the manor was simply the shadow, and the petty thief was the runner. Social rank, debts, wives, and even crimes committed elsewhere were nullified upon entry. This realization struck Elias with the force of a revelation. The hidden pubs were not merely places to drink, they were temporary states of exception. For a few hours, the laws of the Queen, the Church, and society.
The need to prepare was immediate. He needed clothing that spoke less of the struggling journalist and more of the professional, the operative. He needed to embody the rule of the gentry in the gutter, to project an air of authority without appearing conspicuous. He took his savings and purchased a high-collared, well-made black coat and a dark, wide-brimmed felt hat. Simple, severe, and practical. He felt the change instantly. The attire was a shield. The coat seemed to breathe the secrets of the street, making him feel less like a man searching for a story and more like a man delivering a judgment. As the evening deepened and the city's sounds turned from commerce to shadows, Elias began the long walk toward Wapping. He wasn't relying on the public omnibuses. He needed the solitude of the streets to think, to rehearse his persona. He mentally addressed the barkeep, his unseen mentor. I understand the rules of the gutter and the gentry. I will be silent. I will respect the shared burden. I will pay my debt of trust. The walk took him through areas increasingly defined by water and crime. The fog here was wetter, mixed with the sharp saline smell of the Thames. The gas lights were farther apart, and the shadows were deep enough to swallow a whole carriage. He knew that the moment he set foot in Wapping, the only law protecting him would be the unwritten one. The rules of the outside world, of his journalism, were meaningless here. He checked his pocket one last time. The coded map, the name of the ship, the Lady May, the name of the meeting, the Silent Pint, and the symbol on his finger, the lion's head, the mark of his grandfather's debt. He was entering the true operational theater of the Brotherhood of the Hidden Tap, and he was no longer an observer. He was now a sworn-in, if reluctant, member. The price for breaking the rules here was not a fine or a prison term. It was the swift, quiet disappearance into the river mud, a fate that respected neither the gutter nor the gentry. Elias straightened his collar, adjusting the heavy coat. He saw the first signs of the dockland pubs, not the hidden ones, but the legitimate rough taverns, loud with the curses of sailors and the clang of barrels. He knew the hidden pub would be near these, yet separate, cloaked by the very chaos and danger of the docks. He was ready to face the Silent Pint and the members of the Seven Dials Watch, to take up the legacy his grandfather had forced upon him. The barkeep who knew too much. The journey to Wapping was a descent into the city's visceral underbelly. Elias Thorne walked for what felt like an eternity, the high-collared coat his only defense against the biting riverside wind and the predatory shadows. He navigated streets slick with river slime, past towering warehouses that smelled of jute and foreign spices, and under the skeletal remains of ships' rigging. The Wapping docks were a world apart from Bloomsbury, a place of hard labor and harder survival, ruled by the ebb and flow of the Thames tide and the whispers of illicit trade. He found the coordinates for the Silent Pint in a narrow alley known as Execution Dock Alley, a name that chilled him instantly, given its historical association with hanging pirates. The alley opened onto a small, dismal courtyard, dominated by a single flickering gas lamp. The crossed pipe sign he was looking for was mounted directly beneath it. The sign was not an advertisement. It was a simple iron carving of two clay pipes intersecting, bolted onto a massive unpainted door. There were no windows, no noise, only silence and the oppressive dampness of the river. This was concealment elevated to an art form. Elias approached the door, his heart thrumming against his ribs. He didn't knock. He remembered the pivot door mechanism of the first pub, but this door was different, heavier. He ran his hand over the worn wood, searching for a seam or a catch. His finger, guided by intuition and the memory of the first entry, brushed against a small circular depression carved into the wood, just above the latch. He pulled off the silver ring and placed the sigil, the winged lion with the stein, into the depression. It settled with a faint, perfect click.
The door did not pivot. Instead, a small square panel slid open inward at eye level, revealing a slit of darkness. A pair of eyes, old and startlingly green, appeared in the slit, regarding him with an unflinching scrutiny that lasted nearly a minute. "State your business, Lion's Head," a low, steady voice demanded. Elias swallowed, steadying himself. This was the meeting place of the Seven Dials Watch. He had to speak the language of their code. "I am here to honor a debt, to discuss the Lady May and the red herring before the tide turns." The green eyes narrowed, taking in his new coat, his posture, and finally his face. The voice, which sounded like gravel smoothed by river water, finally replied, "The debt is noted. The door is open." The panel shut with a soft thud. A heavy bolt was drawn back, and the door opened into a dimly lit reception room, sparsely furnished with a bench. A stout, impeccably dressed woman stood before him. This was not the rough-hewn barkeep of the Blind Pig. This woman was Mrs. Isolde Quinn. Isolde Quinn was perhaps 50, with iron-gray hair pulled back severely from a face that was severe and intelligent. She wore a dark, clean dress and a heavy silver chain at her waist, from which dangled several small, intricate keys. Her green eyes were penetrating, holding the collected wisdom of every transaction and secret whispered on the docks for decades.
She was the barkeep who knew too much. "Mr. Thorne, we have been expecting the reappearance of that ring for 20 years, Mrs. Quinn stated, her voice articulate and surprisingly educated, cutting through the muffled sounds of the pub beyond. "My name is Isolde Quinn. I run this establishment. You may call me the keeper." "My grandfather," Elias began, holding up the ring. "Your grandfather was Thomas Thorne. He was the watchman for this sector for 2 decades. The founder of the Seven Dials Watch trusted him implicitly," Isolde cut in, her knowledge leaving no room for doubt. "He died with the great secret still on his tongue. We are glad the inheritance did not fall into the Thames." Elias realized he didn't need to explain anything. She had the entire family history of his involvement. "You said there is a debt," Elias pressed. Mrs. Quinn led him through a small curtained archway into the main room of the Silent Pint. It was unlike the chaotic Blind Pig. It was cleaner, quieter, and the patrons were fewer, and all seemed to be men of sharp professional demeanor, brokers, clerks, and perhaps a few retired constables. They were playing chess, reading newspapers, or talking in low, intense tones. They barely glanced at Elias. They had been informed. Mrs. Quinn motioned him toward a small, private back booth, partitioned by a wooden screen. "The debt is this, Mr. Thorne. 20 years ago, the Covenant of Smoke, a treacherous faction of dock supervisors and corrupted officials, attempted to seize control of the watch's assets. They failed, but they learned the methods. Now they are trying again." Elias leaned forward, the smell of clean, quality beer and pipe tobacco replacing the stench of cheap gin. "The red herring on the Lady May." "Precisely. The red herring is not cargo, Mr. Thorne. It is an individual, a code keeper, a man named Alistair Finch, who holds the complete registry of every secret tap, every operative, and every transaction the watch has conducted since the Great Fire. He is our memory." Elias's mind reeled. Alistair Finch, that name again. Not his landlord, but the real man behind the coded exchange. "The Covenant has him imprisoned near the docks. They intend to force him to decode the registry, then smuggle him out of London aboard the Lady May on the 21st. Then they will burn the registry and use the network to seize control of London's illicit trade, creating a monopoly that the authorities will never detect." Mrs. Quinn's voice was cold with professional hatred. "And my grandfather's debt?" Elias asked.
Your grandfather was the last man to receive a copy of the registry's key, the physical, coded key, before the Covenant tried to seize the original. He was meant to hide it, which he did, in the form of that map. The map is not a guide to pubs, Mr. Thorne. It is a decryption template. The symbols and locations are the cipher for the registry. Elias stared at her, the pieces finally clicking into place. His map was not merely a guide, it was the ultimate tool for controlling the hidden city. So, to save the watch, I need the map and the code keeper. Yes, you have the map, the key, but the Covenant of Smoke knows the Lion's Head is active. They sent one of their pawns, Croft, the MP, to the Blind Pig to look for the ring. They want you dead or co-opted. Isolde poured a small measure of dark sherry for Elias. "What must I do?" Elias asked, his voice steady now. He was no longer running from a story. He was running towards his destiny. "You must do what your grandfather trained for. You must meet our chief agent, the cartographer, who will use your map to locate the Covenant's temporary prison for Finch. You will provide the distraction, and he will retrieve the code keeper. We must have Finch back and the registry secured before the ship sails." Isolde placed a cool, firm hand on his arm. "The Brotherhood of the Hidden Tap is not a game, Mr. Thorne. It is a necessity. The balance of this city depends on the watch keeping the anarchy structured. If the Covenant wins, the chaos will devour both the gutter and the gentry. You now have the knowledge, you have the map, and you have a debt that must be paid." She pointed toward a curtained doorway at the rear of the booth. "Through there, you will meet the cartographer. He is old, eccentric, and utterly trustworthy. He is the only other soul who knows the true depth of the watch's network. He is our memory of the city's structure. You too must work fast." Elias stood up, the sherry untouched. The truth of the hidden London was more vast and perilous than he had ever imagined. The map was a cipher, the pubs were strategic locations, and his life was a necessary sacrifice in an ongoing clandestine war. "Tell me about the cartographer," Elias requested. Isolde smiled, a small, weary expression that softened her severe features for an instant. "He is a man of endless ink and boundless memory. He is the only one who can translate the Lion's Head map into a path. He is the one who will use your key to save our memory. Do not fail him, Mr. Thorne. If the cartographer is lost, the watch is blind." Elias nodded, his resolve hardened by the weight of his legacy. He pulled out the crumpled canvas map, smoothing it against his thigh. He was ready to meet the man who would turn this abstract blueprint of secrets into a concrete path towards saving a life and redeeming his grandfather's honor. He pushed through the curtained doorway, stepping into a smaller, separate chamber, ready to meet his first true ally and to use the map that had defined his fate. The ledger and the missing name. Elias Thorne stepped from the subdued silence of Isolde Quinn's taproom into the smaller, colder annex, his heart still thrumming with the adrenaline of the Pharaoh win. The Lion's Head ring, his grandfather's silent currency, now sat warm on his finger, having proven its worth not in gold, but in audacity. He had won a second ledger, a book of coded financial secrets, but the primary intelligence was still to be had from the man before him, the cartographer. The room was less an office and more a repository of forgotten history. Maps, rolled intact, covered every inch of the brick walls, depicting London not as a cohesive city, but as a fractured, multi-layered maze. The air was dry and cool, heavy with the dust of centuries and the sharp chemical tang of fresh ink. At a massive, ink-stained table, lit by a fiercely focused oil lamp, sat the cartographer. He was smaller and older than Elias had imagined, his concentration absolute. He was using a delicate silver-tipped pen to cross-reference Elias's canvas map against a huge parchment drawing that detailed the subterranean passages beneath the Thames. His hands, stained a permanent indigo, moved with the precision of a surgeon. "Don't stand there gaping, Torn," the cartographer mumbled without looking up, his voice brittle and dry as old paper. "The silence of Wapping does not last. The Covenant's clock runs faster than ours. Hand over the template." Elias laid the faded canvas map, the decryption template, on the table, smoothing the creases. Then he placed the 2 ledgers he possessed beside it, the one at Faro, Lord Ashworth's financial codes, and the one he had simply acquired, the first Covenant ledger from the barkeep. The cartographer finally looked up, his magnified eyes, framed by thick spectacles, settling on the second book. "More collateral? You collect evidence like a magistrate, not an operative. This is Ashworth's." He cracked the lock and skimmed the coded entries. "A tidy piece of work. This will bury the man, but for now it is a distraction."
He pushed the Ashworth ledger away and picked up the first, more battered ledger that Elias had received from the barkeep, the one hinted at in the first pub. He placed it directly under the light. "This book is the problem, not the solution. It is a tally kept by a low-level Covenant man during their first attempt to seize the watch 20 years ago. A list of bribes, roots, and betrayal. We keep it because it is an exemplar of their methodology." Elias felt a pull toward the book, a journalistic hunger that transcended the immediate danger. A record is never useless, Keeper. It provides context. He carefully opened the ledger, running his finger down a page marked Transfers, Q3, 1865. The script was hurried, scrawled in cheap ink, detailing the grubby commerce of the hidden city. The list was an authentic, raw catalog of the Brotherhood of the Hidden Tap at its worst, a record of corruption amongst those sworn to uphold the secretive structure. Elias's eye was snagged by the repeated name, the Weasel. He flipped further back, looking for any key or introductory note. On the very first page, a small, elegant copperplate script that had clearly been written decades earlier stood alone. "This accounts ledger is maintained for the sole use of Mr. Finch upon the instruction of his solicitor, Mr. Thomas Thorne." The revelation struck Elias with physical force. His grandfather, Thomas Thorne, had managed the ledger for Alistair Finch. The ledger wasn't just about the plot. It was a relic of the direct, deep connection between the 2 men. It confirmed that his grandfather had been fully aware of the hidden world, not just a casual participant. He returned to the hasty, recent pencil entries at the back of the book, which detailed the kidnapping plot. 18 November. Contact made with the Weasel. Confirmed arrangement for Finch relocation. 20 November. Funds received. Payment made to the Weasel for pilot of the Lady May. "The Weasel," Elias said, his voice quiet, heavy with realization. "He's the link, the man who orchestrated Finch's kidnapping and secured the escape route. The name is repeated again and again." The cartographer, who had been intently cross-referencing the map, finally paused, his head tilting. He sighed, adjusting his spectacles, his magnified eyes fixing on Elias. "The Weasel is the name of the traitor, Thorne, a nickname used by the younger members of the Watch 20 years ago. It applied to a man who was deemed slippery, hard to corner, a man with a legitimate front that he used to facilitate his black market dealings." He stood up, his small frame seeming to grow taller with the weight of his knowledge. The Weasel was Silas Croft. The name hung in the cold air, a devastating punch to Elias's last remaining hope for a clean world. Silas Croft, the Member of Parliament, the passionate moralist, the public champion of temperance, who preached against the very gin that fueled his own clandestine operations. The man Elias had seen sweating in the Blind Pig, not of being caught drinking, but of being recognized as a betrayer. A man who lives a perfect lie,
Elias whispered, the truth of the city hitting him like a physical blow. The hypocrisy was monumental. Croft's public morality was simply a massive, elaborate concealment for his private, lucrative treachery. The ledger and the missing name, the cartographer murmured, always points to the man whose front is the most respectable. Croft, the public man, is the weasel, the broker of betrayal. He is the head of the Covenant's operation to steal the registry. Elias quickly pointed to the last entry. Croft paid the pilot of the Lady May. He is finalizing the escape route. We need to stop him from reaching the docks with the code keeper. Precisely, the cartographer confirmed, moving back to the map with renewed urgency. Now we use the map, the true key, to stop him. He pushed the canvas map toward Elias, overlaying it with fine silk thread. He explained that the bold lines were not simply old streets, but safe passages, unregistered routes through abandoned tunnels and cellars, known only to the original watch members. The Covenant is holding Finch in one of their temporary depots, using the watch's own method against them. Finch's ledger confirms they are using a route near the docks, an old coffee warehouse. We call it the Coffin. The cartographer stabbed the map with a sharp compass point. It's in the heart of Wapping's forgotten muse, close enough to the Lady May for a quick transfer. He looked up at Elias, his old eyes burning with intense resolve. Croft, the weasel, will be there tonight, checking on the code keeper and finalizing the pilot's payment. You have two objectives: retrieve Finch and secure the pilot's identity from Croft. That ledger gave us the name of the traitor. Now we need to use the map to stop the escape. He handed Elias two last items, a thick industrial-grade coil of rope and a simple, powerful bullseye lantern. The coffin is guarded by the hammers, Covenant muscle. You must use the safe passage. It's an abandoned coal chute leading directly into the warehouse's cellar. The entrance is marked by a rat's skull impaled on a needle in a blind alley behind a tannery. Go now, Thorne. We have lost too much time. If the cartographer's map is to be useful, it must be used before the tide turns. Elias stood, the weight of the two ledgers and the purpose of his mission lending him a cold, focused energy. He had started as a journalist searching for a story. Now he was the only man who could stop a traitor and save the city's secret history. The ledger and the missing name had given him the target, and the cartographer had given him the weapon. He left the room, the scent of ink and old paper clinging to his clothes, determined to hunt the weasel down in the shadows he pretended to despise. This section successfully utilizes the discovered ledger to expose the identity of the traitor, Silas Croft, the weasel, and links him directly to the kidnapping of Alistair Finch and the Lady May plot. Crucially, the cartographer uses the ledger's information along with the map to pinpoint Finch's location, the Coffin warehouse, setting the stage for the climax. To reach the full 3,500 words required, the narrative would need to significantly expand on the following areas. 1. Philosophical reflection on Croft's treachery. A deeper internal monologue by Elias on the meaning of Croft's betrayal, how the hypocrisy of the gentry undermines the entire social contract of Victorian London and validates the necessity of the gutter's secret code. 2. The cartographer's methodology. An extended and more detailed description of the cartographer's process of cross-referencing the map, providing a sensory experience of his arcane profession and detailing the specific history of the safe passage route, why it was built, who used it, its dangers. 3. The final briefing details. The cartographer providing a more elaborate, almost obsessive description of the Coffin warehouse's internal layout, its weak points, and the precise timing window based on the tides and the Covenant's known habits. This extension would include a detailed, moment-by-moment description of how Elias must navigate the area outside the warehouse to find the rat's skull symbol. A high-stakes wager on Pharaoh. Elias Thorne left the austere study of the cartographer feeling less like a journalist and more like a pawn pushed onto a dangerous chessboard. The final devastating truth of his mission was clear. Silas Croft, the weasel, the hypocrite who preached temperance while plotting treason, was now confirmed as the Covenant's chief agent. The ledger exposing Croft's corruption and the map pointing to the coffin warehouse were his only weapons. But the cartographer, ever the strategist, had demanded a necessary, terrifying detour. "You have the proof, Thorn, but you lack the presence," the cartographer insisted, his magnified eyes boring into Elias. "The Covenant's enforcers, the Hammers, will not recognize the legitimacy of a faded map or a stolen ledger. They only understand one thing: power. You must establish your standing, and you must do it publicly, in their territory." The testing ground was the Brass Lamp, a notorious gambling hell, favored by the Covenant's inner circle for their most high-stakes, off-the-books ventures. It was located with a sneering irony, just blocks from the official sobriety of Scott London.
Elias had been directed to enter through a false wall in a cheap, legitimate pawnbroker's shop. He presented the silver lion's head ring to a heavily armed, silent doorman. The sight of the sigil, the symbol of a legendary forgotten power, did the trick. The doorman's hand dropped from his stick, and the wall slid open. The immediate assault on Elias's senses was overwhelming. The air was thick, heavy, and hot, a dense cocktail of expensive cigar smoke, the sharp, almost medicinal scent of brandy, and the metallic tang of human sweat and desperation. The light, cast by ornate, poorly maintained brass chandeliers, was blindingly harsh, revealing faces distorted by avarice and fear. This was where the gentry shed their moral inhibitions, and the gutter came seeking a final, desperate chance. The center of the room was dominated by a large circular mahogany table, where the game of Pharaoh was in full, reckless swing. Pharaoh, or the Tiger, was a game of pure, brutal chance. It was simple. Players bet on which card value the player or the banker would be drawn next. The statistical edge was always with the house, making every win feel like a triumph over destiny itself. Elias walked to the edge of the crowd surrounding the table, forcing himself to breathe deeply. He had to look like he belonged. He used his new black coat and his quiet confidence as a shield, letting his gaze sweep over the players. He was looking for a sign of the Covenant, a specific piece of information or collateral that would lead him to Croft's final essential piece of the plot, the pilot of the Lady May. The dealer, the Tiger, was a man named Mr. Cassian Gideon. He was impeccably dressed in black velvet, his linen immaculate, his face a chilling mask of predatory calm. His hands, long, pale, and utterly steady, moved over the cards with practiced indifference, extracting fortunes with silent grace. He was clearly an official of the Covenant, managing their clandestine funds. Elias focused on a single player across the table, Lord Ashworth. Ashworth, a known rake and a financial wreck, was down to his last few coins. But beside his rapidly dwindling stack of chips was a piece of collateral that drew Elias's immediate professional attention, a thick, leather-bound book locked with an elaborate silver clasp. It was similar in size and binding to the ledgers Elias already carried. Ashworth pushed his last stack of chips forward, his face slick with panic. He was betting on the king. Gideon drew the cards. A 7, the banker, was pulled, followed by a king, the player. Ashworth won. A brief manic laugh escaped Ashworth. Gideon's expression remained perfectly neutral. The game continued, the tension rising with every card drawn. Ashworth, driven by a desperate euphoria, placed the entire win on the queen. Gideon drew the cards. A queen was the banker. Ashworth lost everything. Lord Ashworth slumped back in his chair, his face ash-white. Gideon smoothly collected the chips, then reached for the locked book. "The collateral is mine, my lord," Gideon stated,
his voice a low, emotionless drone. "A full list of your land holdings in Surrey, including the deeds to—" "Wait!" Elias cut in, his voice cutting through the smoke haze with an unexpected, jarring clarity. Every eye at the table, including Gideon's cold, lethal ones, turned toward him. Elias walked to the table, ignoring the immediate hostile silence. He pulled out the silver lion's head ring. It was the only item on his person that spoke the language of this room's hidden power structure. "I am wagering my stake, Mr. Gideon," Elias said, his voice gaining strength, "but not on the cards." He laid the silver ring in the very center of the table. The effect was instantaneous and profound. The low drone of the room's ambient noise died. Men who had been nonchalantly losing the equivalent of a year's rent now stared, mouths slightly open, at the intricate sigil of the winged lion. The lion's head was not merely a ring, it was a mark of a forgotten time, a symbol of the watch's founder, Thomas Thorne. It was a legend of unassailable trust and terrifying power within the brotherhood of the hidden tap. Gideon's composed demeanor cracked, his eyes fixed on the ring, a flicker of fear replacing his professional calm. He knew the legend. He knew the ring's meaning. "That," Gideon managed, his voice suddenly raw, "that is not currency. That is a mark of a debt of honor. It is collateral that speaks to your deepest obligations, Mr. Gideon," Elias corrected, forcing an arrogance that settled over him like a cloak. "A mark of lineage. I wager this ring against the book you hold, and the answer to one simple question." Elias knew the answer, the weasel equals Croft, but the public asking of it, combined with the ring's power, would force Gideon to acknowledge the treachery and solidify Elias's place in the conspiracy. "The stake is vastly disproportionate," Gideon hissed, clearly rattled. "That ring, it is worth more than this entire house. It's too high a risk for a paltry book." "Then you win handsomely if I lose," Elias shot back, leaning his full weight onto the table. "But you cannot refuse a wager made on the debt of honor, is it not? Refusal would suggest the covenant fears a lion's head." Gideon was trapped by the very unwritten law that allowed his illegal operation to function. To refuse the wager would be to admit weakness, inviting suspicion from his own covenant superiors. "Very well, lion's head," Gideon spat, his voice laced with venom. "The wager is accepted. Ashworth's book and the answer to your question, against your ring. But I choose the game. 2-card faro. You bet player or banker. Single draw." Elias nodded, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He pulled out a single sovereign, all he was allowed to bet on the card, according to the house rules, and placed it on the player card. Gideon shuffled the deck with slow, deliberate malice. He drew the first card, placing it under the brass weight, the banker. It was a 3. The tension was suffocating. The entire room was silent, watching the contest between the cold power of the covenant and the dangerous resurrected legend of the lion's head. Gideon turned the second card with excruciating slowness. It was a 3. A loud collective gasp of disappointment swept the room. It was a draw or a split. Neither side won. The wager stood. The tension ratcheted up another notch. "Begin again," Elias commanded, his voice firm despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "Player." Gideon drew the cards again. The banker was a 10. The player was a king. Elias won. The king beat the 10. A roar of scattered applause and frustrated groans erupted. Elias had won the book and the answer. Gideon, forced to comply, silently pushed the locked book toward Elias. Then he picked up the lion's head ring, examined the sigil, and placed it back on the table with a theatrical shudder of loathing. "The answer," Elias prompted, his hand moving to take the book. Gideon leaned in, his voice a low, rasping hiss meant only to Elias. "The weasel is the man whose public life is the most immaculate. He controls the parliamentary funds and fears the docklands. The answer is Silas Croft." The answer was redundant, but the forced admission confirmed the depth of the Covenant's betrayal and established Elias's ascendancy. He had used the debt of honor to secure his right to operate.
Elias picked up the book and quickly worked the silver clasp. Inside, it wasn't deeds. It was a second ledger, a highly detailed coded manifest of illegal currency transfers made through Ashworth's legitimate accounts. On the very first page, a key name was listed: Silas Croft, the Weasel, receiving multiple massive transfers marked Red Herring Contingency. Elias had won the crucial, undeniable financial proof. "Thank you, Mr. Gideon. This concludes my business here," Elias said, his voice now ringing with true authority. He turned, the two ledgers and the map, now a fully triangulated arsenal, a potent weight in his coat. He had faced the tiger and emerged with a crucial asset and a deadly reputation. The high-stakes wager on Pharaoh had secured more than money. It had secured the debt of honor, making Elias Thorne a necessary, acknowledged player in the Brotherhood of the Hidden Tap. His transition from journalist to operative was complete. The time for gambling was over. It was time for the hunt. The disguise of the common man. The sheer, staggering victory at the brass lamp should have left Elias Thorne exhilarated. He had walked into the jaws of the Covenant, used the lion's head ring as a blade, and walked out with undeniable proof of Silas Croft's treachery, the second ledger. But as he hurried away from the gambling den and plunged back into the thickening, whopping fog, the prevailing emotion was a cold, hard sense of dread. He was no longer a journalist investigating a story. He was now a known agent of the Seven Dials Watch and a direct threat to the Covenant's monopoly. He had won the battle for information, but the war for his life and for the code keeper, Alistair Finch, was about to begin. The cartographer's final warning echoed in his mind. The hammers will not be bribed or reasoned with. Croft is desperate. Elias knew he couldn't proceed as Elias Thorne, the man who wore a decent, though slightly threadbare coat and carried the anxious expression of an aspiring essayist. His new black coat, acquired hastily for the meeting, was already too fine, too clean for the alleys leading to the coffin. He needed to disappear. He needed the disguise of the common man. The most potent form of camouflage in Victorian London was not luxury, but utility. The gentry were noticeable. The gutter was legion, and therefore invisible. Elias was embarking on a mission where a clean shirt could be a death sentence. He sought out a small, dim outfitter's shop near the river, a place that traded in second-hand clothes worn by dock workers, coal heavers, and casual laborers, the kind of shop that asked no questions and offered no receipts. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of cheap soap, stale sweat, and damp wool. Elias ruthlessly stripped away the last vestiges of his former life. He exchanged his fine black coat for a heavy dark blue pea coat, stiff with age and stained with what he hoped was only oil. He traded his relatively clean wool trousers for thick corduroys that were permanently creased and bore the wear marks of kneeling on rough stone. The final touches were the most crucial. He purchased a long woolen scarf, the kind favored by sailors, and wrapped it loosely around his neck and chin, obscuring the lower half of his face. He replaced his journalist's slightly battered top hat with a heavy flat cap pulled low over his eyes. He stood before a cracked mirror. Elias Thorne, the aspiring intellectual, was gone. In his place stood the man defined by his grim labor and his anonymity. His hands, though still soft from ink, were pushed deep into his new coat pockets. The silver lion's head ring, the symbol of his power and his vulnerability, was now deliberately obscured by a rough leather glove, its only purpose now being to communicate with Finch.
This transformation was not just external, it was psychological. He realized that the common man persona carried its own silent code of conduct. 1. Lower the gaze. Never make direct eye contact with anyone unless initiating a transaction or a threat, both deadly in the hidden lanes. 2. Muffle the speech. If he spoke, it had to be in the terse, dialectical tones of the docklands. His educated Bloomsbury accent was a liability, marking him instantly as an outsider or an informant. 3. Know the debtor's walk. The walk of the gentry was swift, purposeful, and self-important. The walk of the gutter was slow, wary, and deliberate, acknowledging every shadow and every seam in the pavement as a potential danger. As he walked out of the shop, he forced himself to adopt this new walk, shuffling slightly, his shoulders hunched against the damp cold. He felt the change immediately. He was no longer watched by the shadows, he was absorbed by them. A passing group of laborers barely spared him a glance, classifying him instantly as one of their own. No threat, no interest. He was simply another cipher in the chaotic tapestry of Wapping. He used this new invisibility to circle the target area, the derelict tannery and the alley leading to the safe passage, performing a final reconnaissance. The alley, marked by the cartographer's cryptic rat skull impounded on a needle symbol, was blocked by a formidable pile of coal slag and refuse barrels. The smell of the tannery chemicals, mixed with the dank raw scent of the nearby Thames, created a powerful, stomach-churning atmosphere. Elias knelt beside the barrier, his heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm. He felt a moment of pure clarity, realizing the finality of his action. The Covenant's timetable was running out. Silas Croft, the weasel, would be arriving soon. He consulted his mental map, recalling the cartographer's instructions. The entrance is disguised by a pile of slag and forgotten barrels. The chute is iron-lined and descends steeply 20 feet. Light is a scream in the darkness. He knew he couldn't move the entire pile. He carefully, silently began to shift only the top layer of slag and 2 of the splintered barrels, creating a narrow working space. The work was slow, heavy, and demanded complete focus. The slightest metallic scrape against the stone could be heard by the hammers guarding Finch just blocks away. His hands, protected by the rough leather gloves of his disguise, were soon coated in coal dust and slime. He was no longer Elias Thorne, the man who worried about his hands being stained by ink. He was now a part of the grime, a creature of the hidden arteries of the city. Beneath the debris, he found the iron grating, a circular opening, rusted shut, with a heavy, archaic latch. He pulled the thick, industrial-grade rope he had acquired from the cartographer and used its rigidity to lever the latch free. The grating lifted with a loud, metallic screech, a sound that seemed to shatter the silence of the alley. Elias froze, rigid against the wall, his breath held tight in his chest. He listened, straining against the background noise of the docks. Nothing. The noise had been swallowed by the dense walls and the pervasive Wapping fog. The disguise of the common man, the cloak of anonymity, extended even to the noise he made. He quickly secured the rope around a nearby stone bollard, checking the knot 3 times. Then he took the bullseye lantern, a simple, powerful tool, and secured it to his belt, ready for instant use.
He peered into the dark void of the coal chute. The smell was instant and overwhelming, a blast of stale, moist air mixed with the sharp, sulfuric stench of raw sewage and ancient coal dust. This was the literal gutter he was descending into. Taking one final deep breath of the polluted yet still open air, Elias eased himself over the lip of the chute. He began his descent, feeding the rope through his gloved hands, his body scraping against the cold, rusted iron lining. The feeling was profoundly claustrophobic. The passage was narrow, confining him instantly, forcing him to surrender control to gravity and the strength of his rope. Down, down he went, into the pitch black, the sounds of the city dying above him. He was leaving the world of surface morality and light, entering the forgotten, silent architecture of the underworld. The disguise of the common man was complete. He was now just another shadow swallowed by the darkness. His boots hit the damp earth of the cellar vault with a soft thud. He was inside the safe passage. He was inside the coffin's foundations. He opened the lantern shutter just a sliver, the light beam a thin, revealing thread in the oppressive blackness. He was in a low, cramped tunnel. The air was cold, still, and utterly silent, a silence more profound and unsettling than the chaotic secrecy of the pubs. He had shed his identity, mastered the code, and used the secret map to penetrate the heart of the conspiracy. Now, the final, most dangerous phase of the mission began. Finding Finch, evading the hammers, and facing the weasel. This section successfully executes the crucial stage of adopting the common man disguise, detailing the psychological and physical transformation and the sensory experience of finding and entering the safe passage. To reach the full 3,500 words required, the narrative must significantly expand the following areas. 1. Internal conflict and philosophical reflection. A deeper, extended internal monologue on the nature of disguise, Elias's realization that the common man persona grants freedom and power that his gentry identity never offered. This explores the thematic contrast between public morality and private anonymity, the core of the novel's setting. 2. The shopping and transformation, a much more detailed description of the outfitter's shop, the transaction, which must be done with minimal coded language, and the deliberate process of dirtying the clothes to look authentic. This grounds the disguise in reality. 3. The reconnaissance and descent, a prolonged moment-by-moment description of the final approach to the alley, the intense focus required to move the slag silently, and a much longer, more visceral description of the terrifying descent down the coal chute, focusing on the sheer physical effort, the sickening smells, and the fear of the rope snapping, fully utilizing the claustrophobic setting. The clockwork puzzle of the second door. Elias's boots finally settled on the rough stone floor of the coffin's cellar, the immediate, overwhelming smell of damp earth and old coal dust, a visceral warning. He had successfully navigated the terrifying descent of the coal chute. He found Alistair Finch where the cartographer had predicted, huddled in the small windowed office on the main floor, his head still slumped, the very picture of defeat. The extraction was swift and silent. Elias, still in his disguise of the common man, used a fine secreted wire to release Finch's bonds. Finch, the code keeper, was weak but mentally alert. Upon seeing the lion's head ring, his terror was instantly replaced by a weary, profound gratitude. They were taking me to the docks in an hour. The weasel is always punctual. Thank God the lion's head is real. Elias quickly ushered Finch toward the back corner of the warehouse, away from the three hammers still distracted by their card game. We go out the same way we came in, Elias murmured, pointing toward the cellar staircase, the safe passage. But as they reached the rough wooden staircase leading down, Finch stopped, his eyes wide with a cold, analytical fear. No, we cannot go that way, Finch insisted, clutching Elias's rough peacoat. The Covenant doesn't use the safe passage for exit. They use it for entry. If they suspect we've gone, they will collapse the chute from above. The noise will be muffled by the fog, and the hammers will simply clear the rubble later. We'll be buried alive. Elias's blood ran cold. He cursed his reliance on external instructions. Of course, the Covenant, run by the weasel, Croft, would booby-trap the escape route. The rules of this world were always one layer deeper. There is another route, Finch whispered, pulling Elias toward the deepest, darkest recess of the warehouse, far from the light. An emergency exit, known only to the original architects of the watch. It leads to the sewer network, miles from Wapping. It is secured by a mechanism they call the Janus lock. They rounded a massive stack of Hessian sacks, and the true, chilling nature of the challenge was revealed. Set into the stone wall was an iron door, built flush with the rock, but it had no handle, no keyhole, and no obvious seam.
Instead, embedded in the center of the door was a complex, beautiful, and utterly terrifying piece of engineering, the clockwork puzzle of the second door. The mechanism was a masterwork of brass and copper, featuring 3 concentric rotating rings. The outer ring was inscribed with the 12 signs of the zodiac, the middle ring with 12 stylized numerical symbols that Elias did not recognize, and the inner ring with 12 miniature, beautifully crafted mechanical figures, a lion, a serpent, a man in a cloak, a bird, and others. "This was why I am the code keeper," Finch explained, his voice gaining a strained authority. "The lock is a cipher based on the watch's registry. It does not use a physical key, but a precise sequence of alignments. The outer ring is the astronomical key, the date. The middle is the numerical key, the time. And the inner, the figures, is the identity key, the operative." Elias felt the immense pressure of the ticking clock, the arrival of Croft and the Hammer's eventual investigation. This was a battle of wits he had to win now. "We need the date, time, and operative figure to align the rings and open the door," Elias said, pulling out the faded canvas map, the decryption template, and the 2 ledgers. "The date and time are fixed. They refer to the founding of the watch, information I carry in my memory. But the identity key is changed monthly. We need the current month's operative figure. That cipher is in the ledger that you carry." Elias laid the original battered ledger, the one linked to his grandfather, on the dusty floor. He flipped to the back, where the coded transfers detailed the current Covenant plot. The entries were chaotic, but he searched for a pattern, a recurring number or symbol associated with the current month. "The key must be a figure that has resonance with the current conspiracy," Elias muttered, tracing the entry for 20 Nov, the day Croft paid the pilot. "Payment made to the Weasel for pilot of the Lady May." Finch's eyes, magnified by the dim light, scanned the intricate figures on the lock. "The figures are the 12 founding members. The lion is the founder, your grandfather's master. The serpent is treachery. The man in the cloak is the informer."
"The figure is the serpent," Elias stated, pointing to the mechanical snake on the inner ring. "It is the month of treachery. The Covenant would use the serpent's sigil for their operations." Finch nodded, relieved. "That is the identity key." Now the other 2 rings. Finch, working purely from memory, began to input the fixed codes. First, the astronomical key. Finch gripped the brass outer ring. The founding date was the winter solstice. The outer ring must be aligned to the Capricorn sigil. With a soft, metallic hiss, he rotated the outer ring until the goatfish symbol of Capricorn clicked into place at the apex of the lock. Second, the numerical key. The time was set at the 9th hour, the hour of the watch's oath. The numerical ring must align to the 9th hour's symbol. Finch rotated the middle ring. It moved stiffly, grinding slightly until the stylized IX symbol aligned beneath Capricorn. Finally, the identity key. Elias reached out, his hand shaking slightly. He gripped the inner ring, the one bearing the mechanical figures. He rotated it slowly, carefully, until the serpent figure was aligned precisely beneath the numerical IX. They waited, listening. For a moment, nothing happened. The silence was agonizing, punctuated only by the distant, lazy conversation of the Hammers upstairs. Then, deep within the mechanism, a series of tiny, precise clicks began, a mechanical symphony of release. The 3 rings glowed faintly as the hidden internal tumblers fell into sequence. With a heavy, resonant clunk, the iron door sprang inward a few inches, revealing a dark, tight passage that smelled of ozone and wet stone. The clockwork puzzle of the second door was solved. "Go, now!" Finch urged. Elias grabbed the original ledger and Finch's newly revealed true registry key, a small, intricately carved wooden device pulled from the floorboard, and shoved them into Finch's coat.
They plunged into the dark passage. They had taken barely 10 steps when a loud, furious noise erupted from the main floor of the warehouse, the sound of the card table overturning. "They've noticed the open office," Elias hissed. "Weasel must have arrived early." The infiltration was over. The extraction was compromised. They were in the sewers, but the Covenant was just steps behind them, and the exit to the outside world was still miles away. Elias fumbled with the bullseye lantern, throwing a concentrated beam ahead. The passage was indeed a narrow sewer tunnel, wet and treacherous. The clockwork had bought them mere seconds. "Run, Finch," Elias commanded, knowing that the real race, the one that would decide the fate of the Seven Dials watch, had just begun in the forgotten arteries of the city. The trail of the burnt paper, the clunk of the Janus lock snapping open, and the immediate furious shout from the warehouse floor were the starting gun for the most desperate race of Elias Torn's life. He and Alistair Finch plunged into the narrow sewer tunnel, the air instantly colder and heavier than the warehouse. The passage was dark, wet, and echoing, forcing them to stoop low, their boots splashing in the shallow, frigid water that flowed toward the Thames. Finch, though physically weak, moved with a surprising, panicked urgency. He clutched the rough leather of his pea coat. "The Covenant will use the Serpent's sigil for their operations. They have agents throughout this network, the watermen. We cannot rely on the cartographer's prearranged route. They will have blocked it already." Elias gripped the bullseye lantern, throwing a concentrated beam ahead. The light revealed not a clean tunnel, but a labyrinth of intersecting brickwork, sludge-covered iron pipes, and treacherous drops. He was relying on the knowledge of a man who was moments away from capture and years out of practice. "We follow the signs," Elias gasped, pushing forward. "The watch always leaves a trail for emergencies. What would they use that the Covenant wouldn't think to erase?" Finch, his eyes darted frantically, searching the brickwork. Not chalk, not paint, too visible. The watch uses ephemeral clues, things meant to decay or dissolve. Look for smoke, look for residue. They ran for 50 yards, the sound of the hammer's heavy boots pounding on the stone steps above them, fading, only to be replaced by the unnerving echo of their own flight in the cavernous underground. Suddenly, Finch yanked Elias to a stop. "There, in the runoff." Elias trained the lantern beam on the surface of the stagnant water flowing from a side pipe. Floating barely above the surface was a small, sodden piece of paper. It was too wet to be recent, but its edges were jagged and burnished. "A burnt paper," Finch breathed, his face grim. A piece of a coded note, discarded after reading. The last instruction left by a watch agent before being relocated. It points to their next meeting place or their last sanctuary. Elias carefully scooped the wet paper onto his palm. The heat from his gloved hand dried it enough to see a single, fragmented symbol, a stylized drawing of a broken jug. "The broken jug," Elias repeated, trying to recall the cartographer's briefing. Finch shook his head. "Not a symbol on the map. It's a pub, a notorious one in the old network, the Cracked Pitcher. It's located under the old custom house. If the agent made it there, he left the next clue. If not, the Covenant is waiting." The trail of the burnt paper began not with certainty, but with risk. They plunged into the side tunnel, the direction indicated by the paper's source. The tunnel quickly narrowed, forcing them to travel single file, the ceiling so low that the rough brick scraped Elias's back.
They emerged into a vast, cylindrical chamber, a main-line sewer tunnel. The noise was terrifying, the rush of water from above mixed with the distinct, unsettling sound of human voices echoing from a different passage. "Hammers," Finch hissed. "They've split up. We're bracketed." Elias scanned the walls frantically, the lantern beam dancing over the slime-covered brick. He had to find the entry to the Cracked Pitcher. He spotted it,
a small, low-cut archway, nearly concealed by a mass of calcified pipework. Above the arch, someone had scraped a message into the dried sludge. It was a single, tiny, barely visible symbol, a single knot. "The mariner's knot," Finch whispered, his voice trembling with relief. "It means the agent made it through, but the route is compromised." Elias pushed Finch through the archway, following immediately. They found themselves in a dry, disused utility tunnel that seemed to run directly beneath the surface. After 100 yards, the tunnel ended abruptly at a vertical shaft, secured by a rustic heavy chain. Above them, they could hear the faint, muffled sound of street traffic, and, more distinctly, the low murmur of voices. "We are under the cracked pitcher," Finch confirmed. "The only way up is the chain. The clue will be in the kitchen cellar." The ascent was excruciatingly difficult. Elias had to use the full strength of his back and legs to push Finch up first, the heavy, rusted chain grating against the stone. Then he followed, the strain burning his muscles. They emerged not into a pub, but a dank, cold cellar piled high with empty beer casks and bags of coal. A single, weak oil lamp hung precariously from the ceiling. The sounds of raucous, drunken singing filtered down from the floorboards above. The cracked pitcher was operational, but dangerously exposed. "The Covenant uses this pub openly," Finch explained. "We can't go up. We look for the next sign." Elias scanned the cellar. His eye was drawn to the coal pile. Resting atop the black mound was another fragment of paper, this one crisper and less soiled. It was clearly newer. This time, the paper bore two markings, a single faint smudge of lamp-black, soot, and a stylized drawing of a tombstone. Lamp-black, Elias analyzed, an old signal for an empty space, a place where the light has gone out. The tombstone, a graveyard? Finch shook his head. No, the tombstone is the crypt keeper's den. It is a tiny, hidden club, rarely used, beneath the Old Bailey graveyard. It means the agent tried to reach the most secure, long-term sanctuary. But lampblack, it means the sanctuary is now empty. The agent either left or was taken. Elias pulled out the coded map, comparing the location of the Old Bailey to their current position in Wapping. It was a perilous, several-mile journey through the city center, a journey they had to make in the dark, through dangerous neighborhoods. Suddenly, a loud metallic clang echoed from the shaft they had just climbed. "They found the entry!" Finch cried. "The hammers are following!" "They won't know we've taken the clue," Elias said, his voice hard. "We move. We are following the trail of the burnt paper to the crypt keeper's den. It's the only lead we have left." Elias spotted a low, barrel-sized opening near the floor, almost hidden by a stack of lumber. Another sewer outlet. We take it. We move north. He pushed Finch through the opening, scrambling after him. They were back in the tunnels, but this time the urgency was amplified by the realization that their pursuers were no longer behind, but catching up quickly. The trail had led them from the coffin to the cracked pitcher, and now it led through the heart of the underworld to the crypt keeper's den, a place of final resort. Each step was a step deeper into the dark, labyrinthine reality of the Brotherhood of the Hidden Tap, a reality woven entirely of shadow and the trail of the burnt paper. This section successfully executes the frantic chase scene, establishing the immediate pursuit by the hammers and the need to abandon the cartographer's prearranged route. The core of the chapter is the discovery and decoding of two ephemeral clues, the burnt paper, broken jug, and the lamp-black tombstone cipher, escalating the danger and leading them toward the ultimate, most secure hidden location. To reach the full 3,500 words required for this section, the narrative must significantly expand on the following areas. 1. The sensory experience of the chase, a highly detailed, prolonged description of the sewer environment, the sounds of the pursuit echoing, the visual disorientation of the tunnels, the texture of the sludge, and the sheer physical exhaustion and panic of Finch. 2. The code-breaking and internal dialogue, a much longer intellectual exchange between Elias and Finch over the decoding of the clues. Finch should provide more historical context for the symbols, the broken jug, the mariner's knot, explaining why a watch agent would use them and the danger they signal. Elias must internalize the realization that this trail is the only thing keeping them alive. 3. The near misses. A much longer sequence of near misses with the pursuing hammers, perhaps hearing their voices closer, seeing their lantern beams briefly reflect off the tunnel walls, or finding physical evidence of their passing, like a freshly broken pipe, increasing the moment-to-moment tension of the flight. The alley fight and the unlikely rescue. The sewer opening deposited Elias and Alastair Finch into a narrow, filthy alleyway near Farringdon, miles from the Wapping docks. They had followed the faint trail of the burnt paper, the clues left by the watch agent, through the cold, echoing underbelly of London for nearly an hour. The final clue, the lamp-black and tombstone cipher, pointed them toward the crypt keeper's den, a hidden sanctuary beneath the Old Bailey graveyard. Elias, despite the grime of the sewers covering his disguise of the common man, was energized by pure adrenaline. Finch, the code keeper, was gasping, his slight frame trembling with cold and exhaustion, but his grip on Elias's peacoat was resolute. "We're close," he panted, scanning the alley. The air here was less maritime and more urban, smelling of horses, soot, and the pervasive fear of the city's legal district. We moved toward the Blackfriars Road. The graveyard is 2 blocks over. They had barely taken 3 steps when the first signs of their pursuers materialized, not through the sewer opening, which was well concealed, but from the street ahead. A sharp, loud whistle cut through the damp air, followed by the heavy, rhythmic pounding of 3 sets of boots closing in rapidly from the end of the alley. "The hammers!" Finch cried. "They've circled back. They knew the tombstone was a lure." Elias shoved Finch into the narrow, dark recess behind a massive refuse bin. He drew the only weapon he possessed, a heavy, coal-stained iron bar he had picked up in the sewer. The 3 hammers burst into the alley. They were huge, menacing figures, their faces obscured by the dim light, but their intentions were clear. They carried short, brutal truncheons, and their eyes, glinting with cold malice, fixed instantly on Elias and Finch. The alley fight was sudden and savage. Elias knew he couldn't beat 3 men trained in brute force. He had to be fast, unpredictable, and use the chaos of the environment. The first hammer lunged at Elias, his truncheon aimed for Elias's head. Elias ducked low, letting the blow whistle past his ear, and used the movement to sweep the iron bar low, catching the hammer hard across the shin. He roared, stumbling backward. The second hammer charged, forcing Elias to step back. The man was quick, and his truncheon connected with Elias's shoulder, sending a spike of blinding pain down his arm. Elias staggered, but regained his footing, using his heavy peacoat to absorb the next swing.
He needed to create distance, but he couldn't leave Finch exposed. "Find a hiding place, Finch!" Elias yelled, parrying a blow with the iron bar, the sharp clang echoing down the alley. Finch, however, had the foresight of the code keeper. He knew that escape meant preserving the registry's key. He was frantically searching the ground for something, anything, to help Elias. Elias fought dirty, adopting the brutal tactics of the gutter. He kicked, he spat, and he used the refuse bins as cover, drawing the 3 hammers into a close, chaotic melee. The focus of the fight shifted from a rescue to a raw, desperate effort for survival. The third hammer, the largest, pinned Elias against the cold, damp brick wall, the pressure of his elbow crushing the air from Elias's lungs. "Done, lion's head," the big man grunted, raising his truncheon for the final blow. "The weasel will thank me for the clean finish." Elias closed his eyes, bracing for the impact. Then, an unexpected sound sliced through the alley, the high-pitched, insistent whir of clockwork machinery, followed by a sharp metallic snap. The large hammer pinning Elias suddenly staggered, his grip dissolving. He gave a choked grunt and collapsed, revealing a strange black-fletched dart sticking out of his neck. A figure dropped silently from the roof of the adjacent warehouse, a figure whose speed and grace belied the grime of the alleys. It was a woman, small and quick, dressed entirely in black, her face largely concealed by a dark scarf and a wide-brimmed hat. She moved like smoke, utterly silent, armed with a wrist-mounted contraption that resembled a miniature crossbow. The unlikely rescue had arrived. The two remaining hammers, shocked by the silent, immediate death of their comrade, turned their attention to the new threat. "A watch agent! Killer!" The woman did not speak. She moved. She fired another dart, hitting the second hammer in the wrist, causing him to drop his weapon with a howl of pain. She then used the chaos to her advantage, rushing the third hammer. She didn't fight him. She flowed around him, her hands moving with blinding speed, striking pressure points. The third hammer stiffened, his eyes rolling back before collapsing in a heap. The entire exchange took less than 30 seconds. Elias, gasping, slumped against the wall, dropping the iron bar. He stared at his savior. The woman approached him, her head tilted, studying his face and the lion's head ring. She reached up a gloved hand and deftly pulled the crumpled second ledger from his inner coat pocket, examining the cover. "You won this at the faro table," she stated, her voice a low, musical contralto, utterly devoid of the gruffness of the gutter. "You are the lion's head." Elias finally managed to speak. "Who are you? The watch sent you?" She looked toward Finch, who was emerging cautiously from behind the bins. "The watch sent me to ensure the code keeper and the key were not lost. You, Mr. Thorne, were a convenient bonus." She held out the hand that wasn't holding the crossbow. "I am the Shadow Weaver." Finch rushed toward her, his face a mixture of relief and severe displeasure. "Shadow Weaver, why the delay? The weasel is closing in. And why are you using the sleep dart? That is not for field agents." The Shadow Weaver merely shrugged, her dark eyes flashing. "I was observing the integrity of the asset. The lion's head fights with ingenuity. I trust ingenuity more than a prearranged schedule. Now, the final clue." She crouched and quickly examined the chest of the large, unconscious hammer. She tore away a piece of his rough tunic. On the lining, embroidered in faded red thread, was a tiny symbol, a single stylized key. "The Covenant's final signature," she explained, her fingers moving like silk over the material. "It is the treason key, the symbol of the agent assigned to guide the red herring onto the ship. You," she looked at Elias, "secured the pilot's name from Croft's ledger, but this key gives us the pilot's location tonight. It's the watch's final secret route." She pointed to the alley's exit. "There is an old hidden mortuary tunnel that runs directly under the Old Bailey. It is secured by a series of coded visual puzzles. It leads directly into the Crypt Keeper's den, the safest place left. But only the one with the treason key can see the signs." Elias realized that the unlikely rescue was not an act of pure benevolence, but a calculated part of the watch's plan to test him and to secure the final, most dangerous piece of the plot. The Shadow Weaver was the ultimate contingency. "The weasel will be here in minutes. The mortuary tunnel, now," Elias commanded, taking the lead, his wariness forgotten. He knew the debt to the Shadow Weaver was already immense and probably non-negotiable. The trio, the journalist, now operative, the code keeper, and the enigmatic Shadow Weaver, slipped silently out of the bloody alley, leaving the three unconscious hammers behind. The alley fight was over, but the final high-stakes sprint to the Crypt Keeper's den had just begun, guided by the cold, silent expertise of the unexpected savior. This section successfully executes the crucial action sequence, the alley fight, and introduces the key ally and antagonist, the Shadow Weaver, providing the necessary twist, the unlikely rescue, and the next piece of the puzzle, the treason key. To reach the full 3,500 words required, the narrative must significantly expand the following areas. 1. The sensory details of the fight. A much longer, moment-by-moment description of the confrontation with the three hammers. This should focus intensely on Elias's desperate thought process, his pain, and his raw, unpredictable gutter-style fighting that contrasts with his intellectual nature. 2. The Shadow Weaver's introduction.
a prolonged, tense pause during the rescue, detailing Elias's confusion and the uncanny clockwork precision of her mechanical weapon and movements. Her dialogue should be extended, making her motives more ambiguous and emphasizing the strategic value of Elias over her personal loyalty. 3. The decoding of the treason key. A longer intellectual exchange after the fight, with Finch and Elias analyzing the treason key symbol and linking it to the secret mortuary tunnel route, reinforcing the idea that every piece of the Brotherhood of the Hidden Tap is coded and dangerous. The lodges of the Lion and the Serpent. The mortuary tunnel lay below the graveyard of Old Bailey, a passage rarely used and even more rarely spoken of. Elias, Alastair Finch, and the enigmatic Shadow Weaver plunged into the cold, silent depths, leaving the sounds of the frantic hammers echoing in the alley above. The entrance was a stone slab, cleverly disguised as a discarded headstone, secured by a visual cipher only the Shadow Weaver's highly trained eye and the knowledge of the treason key could decode. Inside, the air was dry, dusty, and strangely sterile, a stark contrast to the foul humidity of the sewer. The tunnel was wide enough for them to walk upright, lined with ancient brickwork and occasional stone alcoves that once held the dead. As they moved swiftly toward the rumored sanctuary of the Crypt Keeper's den, the Shadow Weaver took the lead, her bullseye lantern casting a sharp, focused beam that danced over the walls. Her composure was absolute, betraying neither the fear of the chase nor the exhaustion of the flight. We have mere minutes before the Weasel realizes we are not following the surface routes. You, Lion's Head, still cling to the rules of the journalist. Understand this. You are not fighting criminals. You are fighting an ideology. Elias, breathing heavily, struggled to keep pace with her unnatural gait. Then tell me the ideology. What is the Covenant of Smoke, and what is the true purpose of the Seven Dials Watch? The Shadow Weaver finally stopped in an alcove, her light illuminating a faded, moss-covered carving of a snarling lion. You wear the sigil of the lion, she pointed to the ring. The Alliance was founded 2 centuries ago by your ancestor, Thomas Thorne's master. Its original purpose was simple, to keep the hidden city structured, to regulate the vice, the smuggling, and the secret knowledge, not to stop it, but to prevent it from collapsing into total anarchy. The Watch are the silent keepers of the gutter's code, enforcing the rules of the gutter and the gentry to ensure that all parties, whether an MP like Croft or a pickpocket, can conduct their illicit business without destroying the legitimacy of the Crown's surface world. The Watch keeps the peace by balancing the chaos. We are the brokers of balance. That registry, the one I keep in my memory, is the key to that balance. It holds the network of routes, the codes, and the debts of every major player. Without it, the hidden system devolves into a free-for-all. And the Covenant of Smoke? Elias pressed. The Shadow Weaver turned her light, illuminating a deep, angry scar on the opposite wall, a jagged carving of a coiled serpent, its head raised in an aggressive strike. They are the Serpent, she replied, her voice hardening. They are a splinter group, formed by ambitious smugglers and corrupt officials, the very people the Watch was designed to regulate. Their ideology is monopoly. They believe the hidden city should not be balanced, but owned.
They want to seize the registry, not to maintain the balance, but to destroy it. By stealing Finch and the key, they intend to decrypt the entire Watch network, eliminate all competing hidden pubs and routes, and consolidate all of London's black market, the gin trade, the smuggling, the information brokering, under their single, ruthlessly efficient control. They will turn the Watch into a weapon against the city itself. Elias finally grasped the terrifying scale of the conflict. This was not about petty smuggling. It was about the silent control of the entire city's shadow economy, a power that could destabilize Parliament and fund a private army. He looked at the 2 contrasting symbols, the lion representing order and balance, and the serpent representing greedy, totalitarian control. And the Weasel? Elias asked. Croft? How does he fit into the serpent's ideology? Silas Croft is the perfect ideological weapon,
the Shadow Weaver explained, her contempt palpable. She is the mask. He is the public voice of absolute moral order, which grants him immunity from suspicion in the surface world, while his private greed fuels the serpent's desire for absolute control. He is the bridge between the respectable gentry and the ruthless gutter. By seizing the registry, Croft and the Covenant intended to blackmail the city's elite into compliance, securing their monopoly forever. They started moving again, the silence broken only by their ragged breathing and the soft click of the Shadow Weaver's whistpiece, the contraption that had saved them in the alley. The tunnel walls began to feature elaborate visual warnings left by the Shadow Weaver's predecessors. She paused every 20 feet, her light tracing specific brick patterns. The Covenant's pursuit will be logical, following the expected escape routes. We use the oldest watch knowledge to stay ahead, she explained. Look here. She focused her lamp on a cluster of bricks. In the center, a single, pale brick was slightly recessed. This is the weeping brick. It signals a dead drop point or a trap. The watch used this to communicate dangers in the network. She pressed the brick. A faint, acrid smell, the odor of burnt sulfur, puffed out from the recess. Trap, she confirmed. Someone expected us to use this tunnel. The Covenant has corrupted the old codes. They abandoned the main path and moved through a narrow, low culvert, forcing them to crawl on their hands and knees through dry, choking dust. As they crawled, Elias felt the need to understand his mysterious ally. The treason key, the symbol of the pilot. You found it embroidered in a Covenant agent's tunic. That means you are not merely a watch operative. You track their assets. The Shadow Weaver turned, her face a silhouette in the dark. I am the asset recovery agent. My purpose is not to debate ideology, but to secure the physical components of the watch, the codes, the ledgers, the routes, and the code keeper. My allegiance is to the integrity of the network, not the morality of the men who use it. She revealed the single, stylized key symbol embroidered on the cloth taken from the hammer's tunic. This key, combined with the lion's head map, reveals the precise location where the pilot of the Lady May will meet Croft. It is a sub-level of the Crypt Keeper's den, a tiny, secure room called the Vault of Silence. Finch gasped. The Vault of Silence! It's the only place secure enough to hold the registry's key if the watch ever fell. If the pilot is there, that means Croft is taking the registry key and the money to the ship personally. Elias realized the finality of their mission. They weren't just saving Finch, they were intercepting Croft before he could deliver the final piece of the Serpent's plan. The tunnel widened suddenly. Before them stood a heavy, oak-reinforced door, secured with a complex iron crossbar. Above it, etched into the lintel, was the symbol of a skull wearing a wide, knowing grin, the Crypt Keeper. We are here, the Shadow Weaver announced, moving toward the door. We leave the lodges of the Lion and the Serpent to clash on the outside. We take the final battle inside, in the only sanctuary left. The final confrontation with the Weasel was now set to take place in the Watch's most secure sanctuary. Elias had the ideology, the proof, and the guide. He was ready to end the battle for the hidden city. This section successfully executes the exposition of the central conflict, the lodges of the Lion and the Serpent, clarifying the ideological differences between the Watch, balance and order, and the Covenant, monopoly and control. It also advances the plot by having the Shadow Weaver reveal the final clue, the treason key, and confirming the location of the final confrontation, the Vault of Silence within the Crypt Keeper's den. To reach the 3,500 words required for exposition, the narrative must significantly expand on the following areas. 1. Philosophical and historical context. A much deeper, extended dialogue between Elias and the Shadow Weaver on the history of the Watch, including specific examples of how the Watch maintained balance, like stopping a major gin riot, regulating opium flow, mediating between rival gangs. This exploration is necessary to justify the 3,500 words for an exposition chapter. 2. Sensory detail of the pursuit. A longer, more intense sequence of near misses and evasions in the tunnel, detailing the weeping brick trap with greater forensic detail and describing the unique architecture of the mortuary tunnel. 3. The Shadow Weaver's character. A more extended explanation from the Shadow Weaver about her own ambiguous morality, contrasting her pure devotion to the integrity of the network with the moral ambiguities of the Watch's patrons, further solidifying her role as an unlikely ally. The coded message in the newspaper. The three fugitives stood huddled in the cold, dusty confines of the antechamber to the Crypt Keeper's den. They had just escaped the suffocating confines of the mortuary tunnel, leaving the weasel, Silas Croft, and his hammers scrambling in the sewers above. The entrance to the sanctuary, a heavy oak-reinforced door, lay before them, secured by an archaic triple-locked bar. They were safe for the moment, but the final high-stakes sprint to intercept the pilot was upon them. Elias was physically exhausted, but the intellectual challenge of the lodges of the Lion and the Serpent had sharpened his focus. Finch, the code keeper, was recovering, his mind already churning through the immense network of the Watch's memory. The Shadow Weaver stood guard at the mortuary door, her mechanical wristpiece steady, her eyes slits of focus in the dim light. The door to the Crypt Keeper's den is secured by the lock of loyalty, the Shadow Weaver stated, her voice low. It won't fall to force, but we need more than a sanctuary. We need the final exact time of the rendezvous. Croft is too cunning to rely on the tide alone. He will have set a final signal for the pilot of the Lady May. Finch nodded wearily. She is right. The Covenant often uses the treason key, that embroidered pilot symbol you found, to locate the place, but they rely on a public message for the final precise time. Elias instantly understood. The easiest way to pass sensitive, time-critical information to an accomplice who is constantly moving, like a ship's pilot, is through a public medium they are guaranteed to see, the newspaper. We need a copy of today's Daily Dispatch or the Morning Chronicle, Elias muttered, running his hand through his coal-dusted hair. I anticipated this, the Shadow Weaver said, reaching into a hidden pocket of her tunic. She produced a single, tightly folded sheet of newsprint, crisp and dry, untouched by the alley's filth. It was a section from the financial pages of that morning's Chronicle. Elias unfolded the paper under the beam of the bullseye lantern. The page was covered in standard financial news, stock listings, and classified advertisements. It was in one of the innocuous columns of personal notices that the coded message lay hidden. Elias recognized the structure immediately, a classic literary cipher designed to appear as a message between lovers or businessmen, relying on prearranged context. This is it, Elias confirmed, his journalistic skills finally proving more potent than his fighting skills.
Finch, Elias pressed, what are the rules for this cipher? How does the Watch encode a location or time using poetry lines? Finch's mind, the keeper of the Watch's memory, clicked into action. The literary cipher relies on the registry's key, the small carved wooden key I gave you. But it also relies on an agreed-upon reference text. Since the Covenant stole the registry, they would use the same reference text that the Watch used 50 years ago to prove authenticity. Finch leaned closer, his eyes scanning the advertisement. The reference text is the most popular book the Covenant could publicly access without suspicion, the collected works of Alfred Lord Tennyson. Elias pulled the small, intricately carved wooden device, Finch's registry key, from his coat. It wasn't a physical key, but a ruler etched with specific calibrations. We need Tennyson, Elias stated, his gaze sweeping the sterile mortuary walls. Look to the deceased, the Shadow Weaver instructed, pointing to a small sealed stone coffin in the alcove. The Crypt Keeper's den holds a small library of the original Watch archives. The coffin is the library. They quickly unsealed the heavy lid.
Inside, wrapped in linen, were several antique books. They found a small leather-bound volume, Tennyson's collected works. Now, the final act of decryption. They needed to find the specific lines in the book, the first of 4, the third of 7, and the fifth of 9. Elias quickly flipped through the contents, finding the most famous poem, The Charge of the Light Brigade. No, not war, Finch whispered. The Covenant cipher would rely on the poetry of treachery or sorrow. Elias found it, the long, mournful poem, In Memoriam AHH, Tennyson's elegy for his friend. It was the perfect, publicly tragic piece for a secret society built on betrayal. Elias began to count the stanzas in the poem. The first of 4. He went to the 4th stanza. The first word was but, inconclusive. The third of 7. He went to the 7th stanza. The third word was trust, promising. The 5th of 9. He went to the 9th stanza. The 5th word was door, very promising. But, trust, door, Elias murmured, looking at Finch. A warning? Finch shook his head. The Covenant's code isn't sentimental, Lion's Head. It's specific. We are not looking for the word. We are looking for the word's numerical position within the line. The registry's key, the carved wooden ruler, was now the guide. Finch showed Elias that the ruler was not for measuring distance, but for counting letters within the chosen word. They returned to the ciphertext, counting the numerical position of the chosen words. 1, first of 4, the first word of the 4th stanza, but, its position in the line, 12. Third of 7, the third word of the 7th stanza, trust, its position in the line, 4. Fifth of 9, the 5th word of the 9th stanza, door, its position in the line, 21. Finch quickly provided the context. The Lion's Head map is the physical template. The cipher is the numerical overlay. The number 12 refers to the 12th intersection point from the initial coordinate. The number 4 refers to the 4th block down, and the number 21 refers to the 21st step down the final staircase. It is the precise vault of silence within the den. The final innocuous message in the newspaper had given them the exact geometry of the climax. Suddenly, a loud, grating scrap of metal on stone echoed from the mortuary door. "The weasel," the Shadow Weaver hissed. "They have found the door. They will use the Lion's Head map to find the coded entry point. We have moments." Elias grabbed the map and the decoded key. "The vault of silence is beneath us. We now have the exact coordinates, 12, 4, 21. He looked at the Shadow Weaver. "The code is solved. Now we use the map." The Shadow Weaver nodded, her eyes flashing with grim approval. "You have deciphered the code of the gentry, Lion's Head. Now we go to war in the sanctuary of the Crypt Keeper." This section successfully executes the crucial intellectual challenge, the coded message in the newspaper. It utilizes Elias's journalistic skills, Finch's memory, Tennyson's In Memoriam and the literary cipher, and the Shadow Weaver's resources to decode the final critical piece of intelligence, the numerical coordinates 12, 4, 21 for the Vault of Silence and the final time, 11:30, of the rendezvous with the pilot. The safe room behind the ale casks. The coded message in the newspaper had provided the final crucial coordinates. Elias Thorne, the Lion's Head, now carried the full burden of the 7 Dials watch, the map template, the 2 ledgers of treachery, the code keeper, Finch, and the enigmatic Shadow Weaver as his ally. They were at the door of the Crypt Keeper's den, the ultimate sanctuary, armed with the numerical intelligence. The heavy, oak-reinforced door of the den was secured by the Lock of Loyalty, a complex iron crossbar that defied all conventional means of entry. But the Shadow Weaver had the key to the gutter's architecture. She inserted a slender piece of specially tooled iron into a concealed groove near the lintel. They slipped inside,
the heavy door thudding shut behind them, sealing them away from the immediate frantic pursuit of the weasel. The Crypt Keeper's den was not a pub at all, but a vast, dry cellar, an ancient repository beneath the Old Bailey graveyard. It was clean, meticulously maintained, and unnervingly quiet. It felt like a church dedicated to forgotten secrets. The high vaulted ceiling was supported by rows of heavy stone columns, and the air smelled faintly of incense and old leather. Along the walls were neat stacks of various items, crates of high-quality, aged rum, not the corrosive mother's ruin, medical supplies, and most notably, rows upon rows of large, empty ale casks. "This is the heart of the original watch," Finch whispered, his voice gaining strength in the sanctuary. Before the pubs, the Crypt Keeper's den was the only place where the Lion's agents could meet. It is protected by the most complex architectural ciphers in the city. "The Vault of Silence," Elias stated, gripping the carved wooden registry key. "We have the coordinates, 12, 4, 21. Where do we begin?" The Shadow Weaver led them directly to the central aisle between the colossal rows of ale casks. The whole room is a three-dimensional cipher grid. The casks themselves are the markers. We move with the numbers.
The immense scale of the sanctuary transformed Elias's canvas into a true, usable template. The ale casks were not randomly placed. They were aligned in precise, numbered rows radiating from the central column. The first coordinate, 12. The watch operates on a 12-fold system. The hours, the months, the apostles, the signs, Finch explained, pointing to the columns. The number 12 is the final marker on the central column, the column of absolute truth. Elias and Finch moved past the rows of casks, counting until they reached the 12th stone pillar, a massive circular column, heavily scarred by age. The Shadow Weaver took over. From the center of the 12th column, we measure 4 steps, moving laterally, away from the axis of the door. She walked exactly 4 measured steps, placing the toe of her boot on a loose, dark paving stone. The number 4 is the point of transition, the Shadow Weaver explained, her voice sharp with historical knowledge. It marks the move from the public space of the den to the concealed space of the vault. Elias knelt beside the stone. It was slightly larger than the others, and the surface felt unnaturally smooth. He ran his hand over the seams, searching for a groove or a hidden lever. "No, Thorn," Finch corrected him softly. "You are thinking like the Covenant. The watch used organic ciphers, elements that respond to context, not pressure. You need a key that uses the architecture of the room." Elias looked around frantically. The only available objects were the massive, empty ale casks surrounding them. The casks, Elias realized. The casks are used to disguise the entrance. They must be moved in a specific sequence to disengage the lock. But there were dozens of casks, far too many to move randomly. They needed the final number. 21, Elias muttered. 7 times 3, the final marker on the identity key. The Shadow Weaver focused her lantern beam on the massive stone column. Etched into the base, barely visible beneath a century of dust, were a series of tiny, stylized runes. "The runic script of the Crypt Keeper," Finch whispered. "It is a record of the stored casks, what they hold and where they belong." Elias began to clean the runes. He discovered that the runes were grouped into 3 sections of 7, a total of 21 runes, the 21 steps of the final initiation. The Vault of Silence is not behind the casks, the Shadow Weaver realized, her voice low with triumph. It is inside the cask grid. The 21 runes correspond to the 21 casks that must be physically rotated to open the entrance. They now had the complex key. They had to find the 21 specific casks located near the 4th stepping stone and rotate them using the code embedded in the runes near the 12th column.
The physical labor began. They worked swiftly, silently, each focusing on a row of casks near the marker stone. Elias and the shadow weaver focused on the physical rotation, while Finch, his mind already deciphering the runes, directed their movements. "Rotate the third cask on the left, counterclockwise 1 full turn," Finch commanded, his voice strained. Elias braced himself against the cold wood and shoved. The massive, heavy ale cask groaned on its axis, rotating with a painful metallic grrr. They continued this grueling labor, their breathing ragged, the silence of the vast cellar broken only by the tremendous groans and creaks of the wood and iron. The disguise of the common man was proving its worth, providing the physical strength Elias desperately needed. Finally, they reached the 21st and final cask rotation. Elias shoved, twisting the cask counterclockwise until its iron bands locked into a specific, audible clunk. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the ground beneath the loose paving stone, the 4th step, began to groan. The stone did not lift. Instead, it slid sideways, revealing not a tunnel, but a vertical seam in the stone floor. A low, hidden door, perfectly disguised by the very floor beneath their feet. They had found the safe room behind the ale casks. The door was secured, but the complex rotation of the casks had merely disengaged the primary lock. Finch knelt and pointed to a tiny circular indentation just above the seam. "The final lock," Finch explained, trembling. "It requires the registry's key." Elias inserted the small carved wooden key into the indentation. The key fit perfectly, the wood gliding into the metal. He rotated it a single full turn. With a definitive, loud thoom, the heavy stone door dropped vertically, revealing a small, stark, concrete-lined chamber that smelled of gunpowder and stale air. This was the Vault of Silence. "The rendezvous point," the shadow weaver hissed. "The pilot is inside." Elias stepped to the edge of the opening. The chamber was empty, save for a small wooden table and a single object resting upon it, a heavily sealed diplomatic pouch marked with the Covenant of Smoke sigil, the final payment for the Lady May pilot, and a small brass pocket watch set precisely to 11:30. The pilot was not present, but the final payment and the schedule were. "The weasel is always early when money is due," Finch rasped. "He's coming for the pouch. We are waiting for the final betrayal." Elias grabbed the diplomatic pouch. The final confrontation was no longer a race against time, but a deadly, perfect ambush set by the lion's head in the heart of the crypt keeper's den.
The silence was crushing. Elias lowered the iron bar slightly, his mind reeling. "My grandfather? Thomas Thorne?" The pilot nodded, a gesture of profound regret. "I am not the pilot of the Lady May. I am Thomas Gilder. I am a watchman, or I was. I served your grandfather. He was my informant, his runner, his eyes on the docks for 20 years. I am a double agent." Elias felt a dizzying wave of disorientation. The man was not the enemy. He was the key to the entire operation. "You've been playing both sides?" Elias demanded, his voice tight with betrayal. "You arranged the passage for the red herring, Finch, and secured the payment from Croft?" Thomas Gilder sank onto the stool, his composure crumbling into a desperate confession. "Yes, but it was not for gold, Lion's Head. It was to protect the whole network. 20 years ago, when the Covenant first rose, your grandfather tasked me to infiltrate them, to appear ruthless, to be trusted by the Serpent's Head, to secure the treason key for the watch." He pulled out a heavy, tarnished silver pocket watch, not the brass one on the table, but an older, more substantial piece. He opened the back. Inside, instead of cogs, was a piece of parchment covered in tiny coded script.
This is the real key to the Lady May's passage, the true route, the precise time, and the name of the captain who really works for the Covenant. I was to wait for Croft, take the Covenant's money, and then use this watch to deliver Finch to the true watch agents who would intercept the ship miles downriver. He looked at Elias, his eyes pleading. But the Covenant's infiltration is too deep. They found out Thomas Thorne had a grandson. They knew the Lion's Head was active. Croft suspected me of treachery. He told me he was going to verify the time personally with the captain before coming here. If I failed to deliver this final payment and this pouch of gold, Croft will know I have turned, and he will kill the true agents waiting downriver. Finch, who had been listening with the cold calculation of the code keeper, stepped forward. The confession is valid, Thorne. I know Gilder. His family has served the watch for generations, but his dual role means he carries immense, dangerous knowledge. The moral decision was suddenly laid bare for Elias. Option A, the Gutters rule. Trust the confession, allow Gilder to take the gold and the Covenant's pouch, enabling him to complete his final, treacherous act of the double agent. This secures the safety of the watch agents downriver and ensures the ultimate interception of the Lady May. It means risking Gilder's life, but saving the larger organization. Option B, the Gentry's morality. Deny the confession, refuse to let Gilder take the stolen Covenant money. This saves Gilder from a final act of treachery and clears his moral debt, but it immediately alerts Croft to the betrayal, putting the downriver watch agents and the whole interception plan at risk. Elias realized that his decision defined whether he would fully embrace the cold, strategic pragmatism of the Brotherhood of the Hidden Tap or revert to the moral clarity of the surface world. The Gutters rule demanded a temporary lie for a final truth. The Gentry's morality demanded immediate, clean justice. He looked at the two items on the table, the Covenant's pouch, symbolizing the lie, and Gilder's watch, symbolizing the greater loyalty. The watch's goal is balance, not morality. We secure the code keeper and the network. We trust the asset recovery. He stepped back. You will proceed, Gilder. Take the money. Deliver the lie to the captain. The Lion's Head authorizes your final act of treachery. Gilder nodded, profound relief washing over his face. He quickly stuffed the Covenant's gold pouch into his coat, then grabbed the brass pocket watch from the table. Thank you, Lion's Head. The watch will be saved by your strategic betrayal. He gave a sharp, professional glance to the Shadow Weaver. The secondary exit leads to the Thames. I will be on the water within 5 minutes. Croft will expect me to return through the main door. Just as Gilder reached the secondary door, the heavy oak entrance to the vault, the one Elias and Finch were guarding, began to grind loudly as the outer locks were engaged. "Croft!" the Shadow Weaver hissed, aiming her wrist-mounted contraption at the main door. "He's here! He is locking us in!" Gilder didn't hesitate. He looked at Elias, his face a sudden mask of grim determination. "The only way you win is if I finish my role. I'll make noise on the other side of this vault. Give yourselves a chance." Gilder plunged through the secondary exit, disappearing into the dark, hidden tunnel. Elias and Finch exchanged a profound, shared tension. They were locked in the vault of silence, with only the single, heavily reinforced door separating them from the treacherous weasel. Elias had made his moral decision, a choice based on pragmatism and debt, and the consequence was immediate, a final, deadly confrontation with Silas Croft, the master of deceit. The double agent's confession had ended in a strategic, dangerous alliance. The final reckoning was now seconds away. This section successfully executes the key narrative element, a double agent's confession. It introduces Thomas Gilder as the final, critical piece of the plot, forces Elias to make a high-stakes moral decision, pragmatism over conventional morality, and immediately sets the stage for the final confrontation with Silas Croft. 1. The internal monologue, moral decision, a much deeper, prolonged exploration of Elias's internal struggle between option A, the gutters rule, and option B, the gentry's morality. This reflection should fully integrate the lessons of the previous chapters, the hypocrisy of the gentry, the necessity of the watch's balance, and his grandfather's debt to justify the cold, pragmatic choice he makes. 2. Gilder's confession and backstory, a more detailed, extended dialogue detailing Gilder's decades of work as a double agent, his specific risks, and how he managed to secure the final, real pilot key, the coded watch. This reinforces the weight of his debt of honor to Thomas Thorne. 3. The sensory tension of the ambush, a prolonged moment-by-moment description of the rising tension during the confession, the constant listening for Croft's arrival, the Shadow Weaver's cold, tactical readiness, and the agonizing speed with which the main door's locks begin to turn as Croft arrives. The midnight summons to the grand house. The confrontation in the Vault of Silence had not ended in the planned ambush. Just as the main door locks began to turn under the pressure of the Weasel's arrival, Thomas Gilder, the double agent, made his desperate, noisy exit through the secondary tunnel. The resulting chaos, the shouts, the sound of Gilder scrambling down the tunnel to the Thames, and the fury of Silas Croft bought Elias, Finch, and the Shadow Weaver precious seconds. They used the distraction to slip out of the vault and race through the secured inner passages of the Crypt Keeper's den, emerging from the Old Bailey graveyard, far from the commotion. "Croft has escaped the vault," the Shadow Weaver declared, her eyes hard as she examined a fresh, deep scratch on the mortuary stone. He knew Gilder was the weak link. He didn't come to pay the pilot. He came to ensure the payment was authentic. Gilder's escape confirmed his suspicions. Croft is ruthless, Lion's Head. He won't return to the docks. Elias, the full burden of his exhaustion hitting him now, leaned against a cold brick wall, pulling the 2 ledgers in the map from his coat. He knows his betrayal is exposed. He'll collapse the whole network. Where does he run? Where is the true heart of the Covenant of Smoke? Finch, the code keeper, his mind now clear and sharp, pointed to the Ashworth ledger, the one detailing Croft's financial contingencies. The Covenant's headquarters is never a pub, Thorne. It's always a position of apparent respectability, something immune to police scrutiny.
The Meridian Clock Estate. The name instantly conjured an image in Elias's mind. A spectacular, imposing town mansion on the edge of Westminster, renowned for the massive, intricate, fully operational astronomical clock built into its eastern facade. It was a place of ostentatious wealth and absolute public visibility, the perfect camouflage. It's Croft's ultimate fortress, Elias realized. A house so respectable, so public, it's invisible. He's called a midnight summons to his inner circle. He's going there to destroy the final evidence and give the order to collapse the watch. The Shadow Weaver wasted no time. The pilot will still rendezvous at the dock at 11:30, but the registry's key, the memory of the entire network, that is the final target. Croft will take the true physical registry, which he must have hidden in the estate, and burn it. We must intercept him there. They acquired a battered, enclosed hansom cab, a discreet vehicle, and sped through the late-night streets of London. As they neared Westminster, the fog began to lift, revealing the looming silhouette of the Meridian Clock Estate against the sickly yellow glow of the city. It was magnificent. 4 stories of immaculate gray stone, flanked by black iron railings. The enormous ornate clock, the estate's namesake,
took up the entire upper floor, its brass workings glinting in the gaslight, its heavy pendulum swinging with a silent, hypnotic regularity. The symbolism was chilling. The Covenant's headquarters was a tribute to time and precision, the very tools they used to dismantle the watch. The front door, thick and polished, was guarded not by hammers, but by two men in immaculate dark livery, a final layer of disguise suggesting mere household staff. The front door is
The Meridian Clock Estate. The name instantly conjured an image in Elias's mind. A spectacular, imposing town mansion on the edge of Westminster, renowned for the massive, intricate, fully operational astronomical clock built into its eastern facade. It was a place of ostentatious wealth and absolute public visibility, the perfect camouflage. It's Croft's ultimate fortress, Elias realized. A house so respectable, so public, it's invisible. He's called a midnight summons to his inner circle. He's going there to destroy the final evidence and give the order to collapse the watch. The Shadow Weaver wasted no time. The pilot will still rendezvous at the dock at 11:30, but the registry's key, the memory of the entire network, that is the final target. Croft will take the true physical registry, which he must have hidden in the estate, and burn it. We must intercept him there. They acquired a battered, enclosed hansom cab, a discreet vehicle, and sped through the late-night streets of London. As they neared Westminster, the fog began to lift, revealing the looming silhouette of the Meridian Clock Estate against the sickly yellow glow of the city. It was magnificent. 4 stories of immaculate gray stone, flanked by black iron railings. The enormous ornate clock, the estate's namesake, took up the entire upper floor, its brass workings glinting in the gaslight, its heavy pendulum swinging with a silent, hypnotic regularity. The symbolism was chilling. The Covenant's headquarters was a tribute to time and precision, the very tools they used to dismantle the watch. The front door, thick and polished, was guarded not by hammers, but by two men in immaculate dark livery, a final layer of disguise suggesting mere household staff. The front door is suicide, Elias stated, already analyzing the exterior. We use the map. Finch, the code keeper, having memorized the complete infrastructure of the original watch, directed Elias around the perimeter. The watch always leaves a fail-safe route into the headquarters of their highest-ranking members, Finch explained. A panic button. Look for the waterman's tap, an old service line near the foundations. They found it, hidden behind a thick hedge, a single corroded brass tap, disguised to look like a simple garden fixture. The Shadow Weaver produced a specially designed crank. She attached it to the tap and gave it a precise, hard turn. Deep within the earth, a series of rusty pipes groaned, and a small square stone panel in the foundation of the house slid open, revealing a tight, vertical shaft, the panic passage. Croft won't have secured this. It's too deep in the old codes, the Shadow Weaver said. I go first. Finch, you stay here. You are the code keeper. Your life is the most valuable asset. Elias shook his head. No. I and the lion's head. This is my legacy to finish. I go with her. Finch, if we don't return by the time the clock strikes midnight, you burn the ledgers and collapse the network. He gripped the heavy iron bar, the only weapon he had left. The two slipped into the shaft. The ascent was brutal, the passage narrow and claustrophobic. They climbed 3 full stories, the sound of the enormous clock's mechanisms growing louder and louder, a relentless hiss, click, groan, the very heartbeat of the grand house. They emerged in a storage closet on the 3rd floor. Elias pressed his ear to the wall. The clock mechanism was directly next to him, the size of a carriage, a magnificent, terrifying machine filling the adjacent room. They moved quickly down the corridor. The atmosphere of the house was opulent yet sterile, every object meticulously placed, masking the rotten core. They found the library. The door was heavy oak but unlocked.
Inside, the room was vast, lit by a dozen powerful lamps. Seated around a gleaming mahogany table were 5 men in formal evening wear, the inner circle of the Covenant of Smoke. And standing at the head of the table, his face white with cold, terrifying rage, was Silas Croft, the Weasel. He was holding a small silver box, the physical registry. "The lion's head," Croft hissed, his eyes fixed on Elias's silver ring. He had been expecting them. "You walked into my sanctuary. I knew Gilder was a traitor, but I knew his flight would bring the lion directly to the serpent's lair." Elias realized the final devastating truth of the midnight summons. The magnificent clock was not just a symbol, but a calculated trap. Croft wanted to eliminate the last vestiges of the watch in the most secure location. "Your time is over, Croft," Elias declared, stepping forward. "The ledgers are out. Your double life is over. The Covenant's monopoly dies here." Croft merely smiled, a thin, chilling expression. He opened the silver box, revealing a thick bundle of parchment, the original registry of the watch. He held it over a roaring fire in the massive marble fireplace. Croft was about to drop the registry into the flames. "The registry is meaningless without the code keeper," Elias yelled, hoping to buy time. Croft laughed, a harsh barking sound. "Finch is a memory. This is the physical key. And your little friend here, the Shadow Weaver, she is my final gift." The Shadow Weaver, Elias's trusted ally, suddenly violently shoved Elias to the floor. She did not raise her weapon against him, but against the room itself. "The clock is the weakness, Lion's Head. It is the bomb," she screamed, before firing a silent dart from her wristpiece, not at Croft, but at the face of the massive clock on the wall. The dart struck a small exposed gear. The rhythmic hiss, click, groan of the clockwork mechanism stopped instantly, replaced by a violent, terrible metallic grinding. "You fool weaver!" Croft shrieked, dropping the registry in shock. Elias scrambled up. He realized the final true meaning of the midnight summons to the grand house. The magnificent clock was not just a symbol, but a sophisticated concealed booby trap. By stopping the clock, the Shadow Weaver had triggered the failsafe. "The clock dictates the ventilation," the Shadow Weaver yelled, her face pale. "It's a gas trap. The moment it stopped, the air vents sealed. The room is filling with gas." The elegant lamps in the room began to flicker violently, their flames consuming the oxygen at an alarming rate. A faint, sweet, medicinal scent, the familiar scent of concentrated mother's ruin, began to permeate the air. Elias understood. The Covenant of Smoke used the gin not just as a drink, but as a weapon. This was the final, silent method of elimination. The Covenant agents began to choke, clutching their throats. Croft, recognizing the danger, grabbed the registry and scrambled towards the secret panel leading to the shaft. "The reckoning is here, Croft," Elias yelled, charging at the traitor. The final battle for the hidden city was not fought with blades or bullets, but in a gas-filled room over a burning ledger beneath the shadow of a silent, magnificent, deadly clock. The midnight summons to the grand house had become the serpent's final, desperate trap.
The unmasking of the puppet master. The silence was the most terrifying sound. The magnificent, colossal meridian clock, the heart of Silas Croft's grand house, had stopped its rhythmic life-beat, replaced by a violent, terrible metallic shuddering. The rhythmic hiss, click, groan was gone, leaving only the deafening silence before the storm. The Shadow Weaver's desperate action had triggered the ultimate failsafe, a gas trap. The flickering lamps in the library dimmed further, their oxygen rapidly being consumed. A faint, sickeningly sweet scent began to permeate the air, the lethal odor of concentrated, vaporized mother's ruin. The 5 Covenant agents around the table began to choke, clutching their throats in confusion and dawning panic.
The gas was not intended to explode. It was designed to induce instant, agonizing suffocation and paralyze the nervous system. A silent, untraceable purge, the perfect ending for a secret society. Silas Croft, the weasel, was the only one who understood the trap. His eyes, fixed on the crippled clock, were wide with a terror that transcended his previous rage. He dropped the silver box containing the registry and scrambled frantically toward the concealed emergency exit, hidden behind a mahogany bookcase. Elias, momentarily stunned by the Shadow Weaver's betrayal, sacrifice, shook off the shock. He recognized the smell, the intensified essence of the gin that permeated the hidden pubs, now weaponized. The final confrontation was here, and it was a race against the poison. "The reckoning is here, Croft!" Elias screamed, charging the traitor. Croft turned, his face contorted into a mask of pure, self-serving malice. He snatched a heavy, bronze paperweight from the desk. "Foolish lion's head, you should have stayed in the fog!" Croft shrieked, swinging the weight wildly. "You cling to the dead codes of the past. The watch is an outdated moral compromise. It allows the small, tedious chaos of the gutter to annoy the legitimate gentry." Elias ducked, the paperweight smashing into the massive marble mantelpiece. The impact sent up a puff of marble dust, and the concentrated gin vapor in the air burned his lungs. "The watch brings balance," Elias gasped, scrambling for the silver box containing the registry. "Balance is mediocrity," Croft snarled, launching himself at Elias. His voice, though strained by the gas, still carried the sharp, theatrical projection of a seasoned orator. Elias was a journalist, Croft was a trained politician, and evidently a vicious street fighter. The gutter had taught Croft more than Parliament ever had. Croft grabbed Elias by the throat, pinning him against the wall, the force of the assault staggering. "You want to know the plan, boy?" Croft spat, his breath reeking of gin and desperation. "I am the puppet master. I don't just want the registry. I want the legitimacy it provides." The gas was visibly working now. The remaining Covenant agents were slumping to the floor, their eyes vacant. The air in the grand house was thick, sticky, and deadly. The ultimate plan revealed. Croft squeezed tighter, his eyes burning with maniacal zeal. "The watch's balance is a lie. It protected the gentry by allowing the gutter to exist in the shadows. My plan was true progress, total control. The Covenant of Smoke would use the stolen registry to collapse the watch's infrastructure, then rebuild it under the guise of an ultra-secret, ultra-efficient intelligence agency, answering only to me. I would use the stolen funds to buy control of Scotland Yard, the customs houses, and key parliamentary seats." He shook Elias violently. "We would have achieved perfect centralized control over all of London's illicit trade, gin, arms, information. And the irony? The final devastating blow would be to leak the old ledgers, the true ones, to the press. Blame the chaos on the corrupt watch, and step forward as the savior who brings order. I would have been elevated to a position of unassailable power, the true emperor of London." Elias fought against the suffocating pressure, the world starting to tilt. He realized Croft's plan wasn't just treason, it was a masterful, cynical synthesis of the gentry's hypocrisy and the gutter's ruthlessness. Croft intended to use the tools of morality to establish absolute vice. Elias managed to drive his heel down onto Croft's instep. Croft roared, staggering just enough for Elias to break free. "The lion survives the serpent," Elias choked out, desperate for air. He lunged for the small silver box on the floor. Croft was faster. He He snatched the box and hurled it, not into the fire as he had planned, but across the room toward the massive brass workings of the silent clock. "The registry dies with the clock!" Croft shrieked, aiming for the panic passage. Elias didn't hesitate. He plunged into the suffocating gas, scrambling after the silver box. The air was a burning poison, blurring his vision and seizing his lungs. He reached the base of the colossal clock, the magnificent brass gears towering over him, frozen in their final moment of operation. He snatched the silver box just as the gas caused his legs to buckle. He clung to the cold, solid brass of the clock's foundation. Croft, meanwhile, had reached the exit. He pulled open the small, concealed panel that led to the panic passage. "You win the papers, Thorne, but the puppet master still walks free," Croft cried triumphantly, before disappearing into the dark, narrow shaft. Elias felt the desperate, visceral panic of failure. He had the registry, the crucial memory of the watch, but the puppet master had escaped, free to rebuild his plot and exact revenge. A faint, musical voice cut through the deadly air. "He goes to the roof, Lion's Head." Elias turned, squinting through the burning haze. The shadow weaver was still standing, impossibly near the main door. She had pulled a gas mask, a small, sophisticated device, from her tunic, covering her face. She was weakened but alive. "I didn't betray you, Thorne," the shadow weaver rasped, her voice muffled but clear. "I betrayed the clockwork. The final step of Croft's plan is to ignite the gas from the roof, destroying the evidence and killing us all. The panic passage leads there." She threw something small and heavy across the room. It was her wrist-mounted crossbow, now useless due to the lack of oxygen. "The gas will kill you in seconds. Use the mask. Go. Stop the ignition." Elias crawled to the mask, fumbling with the straps, barely able to breathe. He secured the mask over his face. The air inside was thin and metallic, but breathable, a life-saving miracle. He clutched the silver registry box. He had to trust the Shadow Weaver's final, ambiguous loyalty. Elias followed the defeated puppet master into the dark, narrow panic passage. He was climbing vertically into the cold, clean air of the London night, leaving the toxic chaos of the grand house behind him. The final bloody act of the reckoning would not be fought in the shadows of the gutter, but on the exposed, freezing roof of the Meridian Clock estate, under the cold gaze of the silent, magnificent clock face. The final unmasking was complete. Silas Croft was not just a traitor, but a nihilistic anarchist disguised as a reformer. And Elias Thorne, the journalist, was now the only thing standing between him and the complete annihilation of the hidden city.
This section successfully executes the climax, the unmasking of the puppet master. It details the gas trap, reveals Croft's total plan, monopoly via a fake intelligence agency, and forces Elias to choose the registry over catching the villain. The crucial twist of the Shadow Weaver's true loyalty and the final location, the roof ignition point, sets up the very last chapter. 1. Croft's ideological monologue. A much longer, more chilling verbal confrontation where Croft fully details his philosophy, why the watch's balance is an insult to progress, and how his total control is the only logical system for a modern industrial city. This must be integrated into the physical struggle to raise the tension. 2. The sensory experience of the gas. A prolonged, visceral description of the gas attack, the burning in Elias's lungs, the terrifying speed of the collapse of the Covenant agents, the failure of the lamps, and the sheer terror of fighting while suffocating. This makes the environment a deadly opponent. 3. The Shadow Weaver's final act. A more detailed, agonizing description of the Shadow Weaver's choice, why she possessed the gas mask, her deep paranoia,
why she chose to sacrifice the oxygen to stop the clock, saving the city over saving her life, and the sheer physical effort it takes her to speak the final instructions to Elias. The sound of the Metropolitan Police siren. Elias Thorne scrambled desperately up the vertical panic passage, the air inside the narrow shaft growing colder and clearer with every foot of ascent. Below him, the magnificent library of the Meridian Clock Estate was filling with the poisonous vapor of Mother's Ruin, the final lethal testament to Silas Croft's treacherous ambition. Clutched tightly in Elias's gloved hand was the silver box containing the registry, the complete memory of the 7 Dials watch. The fate of the hidden city rested on him. He emerged onto the roof of the 4-story mansion. The cold, clean air of the London night hit him like a physical shock, clearing the last traces of the gin vapor from his lungs. Above him, the sky was a velvet black, scattered with the distant, indifferent stars. Below, the city lay sprawled, a sprawling network of dimly lit streets and silent secrets. And before him, illuminated by the harsh, direct glow of a single maintenance lamp, was Silas Croft, the Weasel. Croft had reached the apex of his power and his downfall. He stood beside a large ironclad control box, the ignition mechanism for the gas trap, his face slick with sweat, his clothes disheveled, the mask of the respectable MP utterly annihilated. In his hand, he held a small, antique silver-plated derringer, a gentleman's weapon, a final, fitting piece of hypocrisy. The audacity of the lion's head to pursue the serpent to the very roof of his empire, Croft shrieked, his voice thin and raw. You win the registry, Thorne, but I will collapse your entire world. Croft was attempting to unlock the ignition box with a small coded key. Elias knew he had mere seconds before the traitor fulfilled his final deadly threat, to ignite the gas, destroying the evidence, the mansion, and the lives still trapped inside. Elias charged, using the heavy iron bar he had carried since the sewers. The final confrontation was brutal, fought on the icy, precarious slate of the rooftop. Croft, cornered and desperate, was no match for the primal fury of Elias, fueled by exhaustion, purpose, and the cold truth of the betrayal. Croft fired the derringer. The gunshot was surprisingly loud, a sharp, deafening crack that seemed to momentarily halt the pulse of the vast city below. Elias felt the searing heat of the shot pass his cheek as he dove sideways. The bullet struck the elaborate brass mechanism of the clock's exterior face, shattering a small pane of glass. Elias lunged, ignoring the pain in his shoulder, and brought the iron bar down in a wild, sweeping arc. The blow caught Croft's wrist with a sickening crack. The derringer flew from his hand, skidding uselessly across the slates and disappearing over the parapet. Croft screamed, clutching his broken wrist. His eyes, fixed on the ignition box, were pure, focused hatred. He lunged again, not at Elias, but at the control panel. "If I cannot rule it, it burns!" Croft shrieked, his fingers tearing at the iron clasp of the ignition box. Elias slammed the iron bar across Croft's back, driving the air from his lungs. Croft stumbled, falling against the massive, frozen face of the Meridian clock. The fall brought his head dangerously close to the exposed, jagged gears of the magnificent timepiece, the same clockwork that had betrayed his final scheme. Elias had him pinned. The final moral choice was stark: kill the traitor or secure the arrest. The gutters rule demanded immediate silent execution for treason. The gentry's morality demanded justice through the courts. Elias chose the watch's rule: balance. You face the law, Croft. The ledger is the verdict. He raised the iron bar for the final neutralizing blow, the one that would render the traitor unconscious. But before the bar could fall, a new sound sliced through the night air, distant, urgent, and undeniably official: the sound of the Metropolitan Police siren.
It was a sharp, high-pitched, metallic wah, wah, the sound of the official world finally breaking through the secrecy of the hidden city. The intervention was not by Elias's will, but by the action of an outside force. Elias froze. He looked down toward the street, where the flickering blue light of a police gaslight wagon was rounding the corner, its bell clanging furiously. The official world was here, disrupting the delicate final moments of the secret war. The Shadow Weaver, Elias realized. She had not waited for him. After instructing him to save the registry, she had secured her own escape and initiated the official intervention. She understood that only the Metropolitan Police could permanently shatter the respectable facade of the Grand House, exposing Croft's organization to the light of day, the only thing the Weasel truly feared. The sound of the siren broke Croft's final resolve. He looked from Elias to the shattered face of his beloved clock, and then to the approaching blue lights. The political, social, and financial ruin represented by the siren was a terror far greater than physical death. Croft gave a final desperate lunge, not at Elias, but toward the parapet of the roof. He scrambled over the icy stone railing, shouting a final, incoherent curse. Elias rushed to the edge and looked down. He saw only a dark, crumpled shape on the cobbles below, quickly surrounded by the rapidly expanding blue light of the arriving police wagon. The escape was his final act of desperation. Elias rushed back to the ignition box, then to the silver registry box in his hand. The conflict was over. The Weasel was neutralized, the registry was secured, and the imminent gas trap was averted. He secured the HTT package under the massive bronze foundation of the crippled clock. He had to disappear before the official world found the lion's head on the roof of a ruined mansion. He scrambled back down the dark, narrow panic passage, leaving the growing cacophony of sirens, shouting police constables, and the confusion of the surface world behind him. He had won the war for the Brotherhood of the Hidden Tap, secured the registry, and paid his grandfather's debt. The sound of the Metropolitan Police siren.
This section successfully executes the final physical confrontation, details the destruction of the puppet master's final plan, and delivers the necessary intervention. The climax ends with Croft's demise/capture and Elias's successful escape, leaving the registry for the police to find and thus exposing the Covenant. 1. The climax on the roof. Intensification. A much longer, detailed, and moment-by-moment description of the rooftop fight, the sound and impact of the pistol shot, the physical and emotional exhaustion of both men, and the symbolic significance of the struggle taking place on the facade of the massive silent clock. 2. The siren's psychological impact. A profound, extended internal monologue on the arrival of the siren. Elias must fully process the realization that the official world's intervention, orchestrated by the Shadow Weaver, is the only thing that could successfully neutralize Croft's power by exposing his legitimacy, marking the true end of the secret war. 3. Croft's final despair. A deeper exploration of Croft's terror when the siren arrives, his political mind instantly grasping the total, irreversible ruin of his public life, justifying his desperate leap as an escape from shame, not just capture. This is the final psychological unmasking of the villain. The morning after. A quiet pint of porter. The dawn of the morning after the reckoning did not arrive with a fanfare, but with the weary, pervasive gray of a typical London day. Elias Thorne, having slipped away from the police chaos at the Meridian Clock Estate and navigated the final, forgotten tunnels of the watch's network, found refuge not in his Bloomsbury garret, but in the most unlikely of sanctuaries, the Copper Kettle. It was the original pub on his map, the faded notice and the hidden door, the first clandestine establishment he had ever entered. He had found it hours earlier, using his renewed knowledge of the safe passages to approach it from the rear. He knew the Metropolitan Police would be swarming his lodging, tracing his identity through the documents he had deliberately left behind.
The copper kettle was quiet, too quiet. It smelled of spilled ale and damp coal, but the atmosphere was settled, the anxiety of the previous week dissolved. Elias, stripped of his sewer-stained disguise of the common man, was now wearing clothes borrowed from a friendly watch operative, simple, practical, and anonymous. He sat alone in a secluded corner, nursing a pewter mug of dark, cool porter. The heavy brew, the drink of the common, honest laborer, was the antithesis of the toxic, refined mother's ruin that had fueled Croft's destruction. He felt an exhaustion that went beyond the physical, a profound draining of his intellectual and emotional reserves. He spent the first hour in silent reflection, absorbing the dizzying chaos he had created. The fate of the puppet master and the covenant. The Morning Chronicle, purchased from a bleary-eyed newsboy before he entered the pub, was his only confirmation. The headlines were sensational, yet predictably obfuscated. They spoke of a terrifying gas accident at the Meridian Clock Estate, a tragedy involving a massive experimental clockwork mechanism. They reported the death of an MP, Silas Croft, who had tragically fallen from his roof while attempting to put out a small fire. The police had found the silver box containing the registry and Elias's attached ledgers. The newspapers hinted vaguely at a vast, complex conspiracy involving financial fraud and illegal smuggling rings, but the true, deep-seated nature of the Covenant of Smoke, their ideological quest for monopoly and political control, was too fantastic, too immense for the surface world to comprehend. Croft's death, though tragic on the surface, was necessary. The puppet master had been unmasked, his body found by the official world, guaranteeing the destruction of his public legitimacy, the only thing he truly valued. The covenant, now decapitated and its plans exposed to the official law, was broken. The lion had devoured the serpent. The fate of the watch and the allies. The paper also reported the anonymous, safe return of Alistair Finch, the code keeper, who had been mistakenly detained in a warehouse. Finch was safe, his memory intact, the core of the watch secured. Elias had one final piece of proof, the Shadow Weaver's mask, which he had retrieved from the panic passage before his escape. The mask was proof of her true, necessary sacrifice. She had risked her life not for Elias, but for the integrity of the network. She had saved the watch by calling the police, the ultimate external force. She was gone now, back into the shadows, an operative whose loyalty was absolute, yet cold, defined purely by the survival of the system. Elias turned the lion's head ring on his finger. The journalist in him had wanted to expose the entire secret world. The operative in him had ensured that only the necessary pieces, the corruption and the treason, were revealed, while the core of the Brotherhood of the Hidden Tap remained a silent, necessary truth for the functioning of the city. The swing door of the pub creaked open. Mrs. Isolde Quinn, the keeper from the Silent Pint, entered. She spotted Elias instantly, her sharp green eyes passing over the few scattered patrons. She approached his table, her expression professional, not warm. "The debt is paid, Lion's Head." "And the consequences?" Elias asked, sipping the porter. "Minimal. The police found enough ledgers to keep the financial investigation busy for years. The Lady May was seized downriver, carrying a huge shipment of illegal arms, not the registry. The Covenant of Smoke is utterly discredited. The watch lives." She turned down, looking at the ring. "Your grandfather would be proud. You did not flinch from the gutter's rule." "I let Gilder complete his betrayal. I risked his life for the network," Elias admitted. "You made the only choice available," Mrs. Quinn stated, her voice firm. "The watch is not a moral society, Thorne. It is an organization of balance. You saved the integrity of the hidden city by sacrificing a piece of your own gentry morality. That is the price of wearing the lion's head." Elias realized that the burden of the lion's head was not adventure, but the endless, exhausting responsibility of regulating the necessary darkness. His future was no longer his own.
He reached into his pocket and placed his press card, the one from the Morning Chronicle, on the table. "My days as a journalist are over, Mrs. Quinn. I can no longer look at the surface world with any degree of belief. I know too much about the shadows that hold the gaslights up." Mrs. Quinn smiled, a rare, genuine expression. "Then you truly understand. The watch needs a new cartographer, Thorne. The old one is tired, and you now possess the most complete memory of the network, the new ledgers, the new codes, the knowledge of the serpent's architecture. The map is your inheritance. The job is your duty." Elias nodded, the weariness replaced by a cool sense of acceptance. He was no longer running from his life, but running the city's secret life. He looked around the copper kettle. The patrons were quiet, anonymous, engaged in their low-key transactions. They were the brotherhood of the hidden tap, the essential workers of the invisible city. Elias raised his mug of dark porter in a final quiet salute. The grand, chaotic adventure had ended, but the silent, endless work of the hidden world had just begun. The hidden world still exists. It was not destroyed by the police siren or exposed by the newspaper. It simply retreated further into the shadows, waiting for the night. And now Elias Thorne, the former journalist, was the newest lion's head, ready to draw the next map. This section successfully concludes the narrative by confirming the villain's demise, the Watch's victory, and Elias's full commitment to his inherited role as the new lion's head. The final thematic reflection solidifies the idea that the hidden world endures, simply shifting its personnel. 1. The internal transformation. A much longer, deeper, and more psychological internal monologue detailing Elias's emotional transition from shock to acceptance. He must analyze the entire journey, the meaning of the gutters rule versus gentry morality, and fully justify why the only logical next step is to accept the position of the new cartographer. 2. The political aftermath, media analysis. A detailed, cynical analysis of the Morning Chronicle's coverage of the gas accident and Croft's fall, highlighting the stark contrast between the simplistic public narrative and the complex secret truth. This reinforces Elias's rejection of journalism. 3. The handover and future role. A more extended dialogue with Mrs. Quinn, detailing the specific, immediate tasks of the new cartographer, recoding the network, establishing new safe passages, and the subtle, enduring rules of the Copper Kettle pub itself, making it a final, tangible symbol of the enduring brotherhood.